The melody shouldn't exist. When Ethan Cole's fingers touched the piano keys at the Sterling Industries Christmas Gala, he had no idea he was about to shatter a CEO's carefully constructed world. The song, unfinished, haunting, impossible, stopped Madeline Rowe mid-breath. She'd buried that tune 16 years ago with the only man who knew it. Yet here it was, flowing from the hands of a maintenance worker she'd never truly noticed. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some loves transcend time, class, and tragedy. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling Industries headquarters cast diamonds of light across marble floors that had been polished to mirror perfection. Snow fell softly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, each flake catching the glow of Manhattan's skyline like tiny stars descending to Earth. Inside, 300 of the city's most powerful people moved through the grand ballroom in choreographed elegance, champagne flutes catching light, designer gowns whispering against Italian leather shoes, laughter calculated to impress rather than express joy. Madeline Rowe stood on the second-floor balcony, looking down at the celebration she'd orchestrated with military precision. At 34, she was the youngest CEO in Sterling Industries' 70-year history, a fact that her father, the former CEO and current chairman, never let anyone forget. Her black evening gown was armor disguised as fashion, structured and severe, with a neckline that suggested elegance without vulnerability. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into permanent alertness. She held her champagne glass like a weapon, her grip controlled, her posture perfect. "You're doing it again," a voice said beside her. Madeline didn't turn. She recognized the voice of her executive assistant, Claire Morrison, a woman 10 years her senior who'd somehow managed to become the closest thing Madeline had to a friend. "Doing what?" "Looking at them like they're chess pieces instead of people." "They are chess pieces," Madeline replied, her voice cool as the winter air outside. "Every person in this room serves a purpose. Every conversation is a transaction. You know that as well as I do." Claire sighed, a sound of resigned affection. "It's Christmas Eve, Madeline. Would it kill you to pretend to enjoy yourself?" "Enjoyment is inefficient. And yet, here we are, at a party." "A networking opportunity disguised as a party," Madeline corrected. "There's a difference." Below them, the crowd parted slightly as a man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo made his way through the room with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied anything in his life. Jonathan Sterling III, her fiancé, her father's chosen successor to the family empire, a man whose last name opened every door in the city. He was handsome in the way of people who'd been told they were handsome their entire lives, his smile practiced, his charm weaponized. He looked up, catching Madeline's eye, and raised his glass in a private toast. She returned the gesture with mechanical precision. "You don't love him," Claire said quietly. "Love is for people who can afford to be vulnerable," Madeline responded. "I'm not one of those people." "Your mother was—" "My mother is dead," Madeline cut her off, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "And whatever romantic notions she had about love died with her. I learned that lesson early, Claire. Better to build an empire than to waste time chasing feelings that fade." Claire was silent for a moment, then touched Madeline's arm gently. "Not all feelings fade, Maddie." The nickname, one only Claire and her long-dead mother had ever used, pierced through Madeline's armor for just a moment. Her jaw tightened. "Don't call me that here." "Then stop pretending you're made of ice." Before Madeline could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A small girl, no more than 7 years old, had somehow slipped past security and was standing in the doorway, looking overwhelmed by the grandeur around her. She wore a simple red dress that looked homemade, her dark curls slightly disheveled, her eyes wide with wonder and fear in equal measure. "How did a child get in here?" Madeline asked, her CEO voice sliding back into place. "Claire, handle it." But before Claire could move, a man appeared behind the girl, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He was tall, lean, in a way that suggested he'd once been broader, but had been worn down by life's hardships. He wore the navy blue uniform of Sterling Industries' maintenance staff, the fabric clean but faded from too many washings. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "I'm so sorry," the man was saying to the security guard who'd followed them. His voice was quiet, educated in a way that didn't match his uniform. "Sophie, sweetheart, I told you to wait in the break room." "But Daddy," the girl said, her voice small but determined. "You promised we'd see the Christmas tree. You said it was the biggest tree in the city." The man, Ethan Cole, according to the name badge on his uniform, knelt down to his daughter's level, his expression a mixture of love and profound sadness that made Madeline's chest tighten unexpectedly. "I know, Princess, but this isn't our party. These aren't our people." "Why not?" Sophie asked with the devastating logic of children. "You work here. You help keep everything beautiful. Doesn't that make it your party too?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, and Madeline saw something flicker across his face. Pain, resignation, acceptance of an injustice he couldn't explain to his daughter. "It's complicated, sweetheart." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the security guard said, not unkindly but firmly. "This is an executive event. Staff aren't—" "He can stay," Madeline heard herself say. The words surprised everyone, including herself. Claire turned to stare at her, eyebrows raised. The security guard looked up at the balcony, confused, and Ethan Cole lifted his gaze to meet hers. For a moment, their eyes locked across the crowded room, and Madeline felt something she couldn't name. A recognition without context, a sense of familiarity with a complete stranger. His eyes were gray, like winter clouds, and held depths that made her want to look away and step closer at the same time. "Ma'am?" the security guard prompted. Madeline shook herself internally. What was she doing? She had protocols, hierarchies, carefully maintained boundaries between management and staff. This was a violation of every principle she'd built her career on. And yet— "It's Christmas Eve," she said, echoing Claire's earlier words. "The girl wants to see the tree. Let them see the tree." She turned and walked away before anyone could respond, before she could see the gratitude in Ethan Cole's expression, before she could question why she'd intervened at all. "Well," Claire said, following her, barely suppressing a smile, "that was unexpected." "It was a lapse in judgment," Madeline replied curtly. "It won't happen again." But even as she said it, she found herself glancing back toward the entrance, watching as Sophie Cole's face lit up at the sight of the 30-foot Christmas tree dominating the center of the ballroom, its branches heavy with handmade ornaments donated by children from the city's foster care system, a charity initiative Madeline had approved for tax purposes, not sentiment. The party continued around them. Jonathan found Madeline in the crowd, sliding an arm around her waist with possessive familiarity. "You look tense, darling. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she replied automatically. "Your father wants to make the announcement at midnight," Jonathan continued, his voice low in her ear. "The merger with Blackwood Technologies. It's going to change everything, Madeline. Sterling Industries will be unstoppable." "We're already unstoppable," she said. "Then we'll be invincible." He kissed her temple, a gesture that should have felt intimate but instead felt performative. "This is what we've worked for, what your father has worked for. Legacy, darling. True, lasting legacy." Madeline nodded, but her attention had drifted. Across the room, Ethan Cole was kneeling beside his daughter, near the tree, pointing out ornaments, his face transformed by a smile that made him look younger, less haunted. Sophie was clapping her hands together, bouncing on her toes, radiating pure, uncomplicated joy. When was the last time Madeline had felt joy like that? When was the last time anything had felt uncomplicated? She couldn't remember. The evening wore on. Deals were struck over canapes. Alliances were forged over cocktails. Madeline moved through the crowd with practiced grace, saying the right things to the right people, never revealing more than necessary, always maintaining control. But some part of her attention kept returning to the maintenance worker and his daughter, who had found a quiet corner near the piano, a beautiful grand piano that had been moved into the ballroom for the occasion, but remained unplayed, more decoration than instrument. Around 10 o'clock, Madeline noticed Sophie growing tired. her head resting against her father's shoulder as he carried her toward the exit. The girl was trying to stay awake, fighting against exhaustion with the determination of children everywhere who don't want the magic to end. "Daddy," Madeline heard Sophie say as they passed near where she stood. "Will you play the song? The one that helps me sleep?" "Not here, Princess," Ethan replied quietly. "These aren't our people," Sophie finished for him, her voice sad. "I know." Something twisted in Madeline's chest. Before she could think about it, before she could apply logic or reason or any of the careful calculation that usually governed her decisions, she stepped forward. "The piano is available," she said. Ethan turned, surprised. Up close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the careful distance he maintained even as his daughter looked at her with open curiosity. "Ms. Rowe," he said, and she noticed he knew her name, had probably known it the entire time. "That's very generous, but we should be going. Sophie's tired, and I have the late shift in the maintenance bay." "One song," Madeline insisted, though she couldn't explain why, even to herself. "Your daughter asked. It's Christmas Eve." She was saying that a lot tonight. It's Christmas Eve. As if that explained everything, as if that justified breaking every rule she'd lived by for the past decade. Ethan hesitated, looking down at Sophie, who was now wide awake and staring at her father with pleading eyes. "Please, Daddy? Just the sleeping song?" Ethan's resistance crumbled visibly. "All right, just one song." He carried Sophie to the piano, setting her down gently on the bench beside him. The crowd had mostly stopped paying attention to them, absorbed in their own conversations, their own machinations. But Madeline found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. Claire appeared beside her again. "You're doing it again," she whispered. "Doing what?" "Looking like you're seeing something the rest of us can't see." Madeline didn't respond. She couldn't, because Ethan Cole had placed his hands on the keys, and she noticed for the first time how elegant they were. Long fingers, careful movement, the hands of someone who'd been trained, who'd spent years perfecting a craft, not the hands of a maintenance worker. He began to play, and the sound that emerged from the piano was so pure, so heartbreakingly beautiful, that conversations began to die around the room. People turned, curious, drawn by the unexpected artistry emerging from the corner of the ballroom. The melody was simple at first, a gentle lullaby that spoke of safety and comfort and unconditional love. Sophie leaned against her father, her eyes drooping, a small smile on her lips. It was a private moment made public, and Madeline felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. But then the melody shifted. It began to grow, to deepen, to reveal layers that shouldn't have been there in a simple lullaby. The notes became more complex, more haunting, building towards something that felt both familiar and impossible. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. Her champagne glass slipped from nerveless fingers, the sound of shattering crystal lost beneath the rising music. Because she knew this song. She knew every note, every progression, every heartbreaking turn of the melody. This was the song that had died 16 years ago. The song that had been buried with its composer. The song that existed only in her most carefully guarded memories, in the locked box of a past she'd tried desperately to forget. The song her first love had written for her in those beautiful, terrible last days before he was killed. But that was impossible. Marcus had died in a car accident at 19. The song had been unfinished, existing only in the few recordings on his phone, in the handwritten notes in a journal she'd kept hidden for years before finally burning it in a desperate attempt to move forward with her life. No one else knew this song. No one. The room had gone completely silent now. Every eye was on Ethan Cole, who sat at the piano with his daughter tucked against his side, his eyes closed, his entire being focused on the music flowing from his fingers. He played with the skill of a virtuoso, with the emotion of someone who understood every note intimately, who'd lived inside this melody until it became part of his soul. He played like the music was killing him. Madeline couldn't breathe. The ballroom seemed to spin around her, the chandeliers blurring into streams of light, the faces of the crowd dissolving into meaningless shapes. She was 19 again, sitting in Marcus's cramped apartment, listening to him work through this exact melody on his keyboard, watching his face light up as he found the perfect progression. "It's for you, Maddie," he'd said, using the nickname she'd later forbidden everyone from using. "Every note is for you. When it's finished, when I play it at Carnegie Hall someday, everyone will know that you're my muse, that you're the reason I became who I'm meant to be." But he'd never finished it. The accident had happened 3 weeks later, and the song had died with him. Except it hadn't. Ethan's fingers moved across the keys with increasing intensity, building toward a crescendo that Marcus had never reached, taking the melody to places it had never gone before. It was the same song, but completed, transformed, given an ending that was both triumphant and devastating. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Ethan opened his eyes, looking down at Sophie, who had fallen asleep against his side, her small hand curled against his chest. He sat there for a moment, still, as if returning from somewhere very far away. Then he seemed to remember where he was, who was watching. He looked up. His eyes found Madeline's across the silent room. And in that moment of connection, something passed between them, a recognition, a question, an impossible possibility that made Madeline's carefully constructed world begin to fracture. The crowd erupted into applause. It started slowly, uncertain, then grew until the ballroom thundered with appreciation. People were standing, champagne forgotten, moved by something they couldn't quite explain but couldn't deny. Even Jonathan was clapping, though his expression was puzzled, calculating. But Madeline didn't move. She couldn't. She stood frozen, staring at this man she didn't know, this maintenance worker who'd somehow reached into her past and pulled out the one thing she'd thought was lost forever. Ethan stood carefully, lifting his sleeping daughter into his arms. He nodded politely to the applauding crowd, looking uncomfortable with the attention, eager to escape. He began making his way toward the exit, head down, movements careful. But Madeline was already moving, pushing through the crowd with none of her usual grace, her armor cracking with each step. "Wait!" she called out, her voice cracking on the word. "Wait!" Ethan stopped, turned. Up close, she could see the wariness in his expression, the way he held his daughter protectively, the way he seemed to brace himself for confrontation. "That song," Madeline said, her carefully modulated CEO voice stripped away, leaving something raw and unguarded. "Where did you learn that song?" For a long moment, Ethan just looked at her. She saw something flicker in his gray eyes, recognition, perhaps, or maybe fear. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you mean, Ms. Rowe. It's just a lullaby, something I picked up somewhere." "That's a lie," she said, and she didn't care that people were watching now, that Jonathan was pushing through the crowd toward them, that her father had appeared on the balcony above, drawn by the commotion. "That song was written by someone I knew, someone who died 16 years ago. That song was never published, never recorded, never shared with anyone outside of—" She stopped, her throat closing around the words. "Outside of me. That song was mine." Ethan's expression shifted, became something she couldn't read. Pain, regret, resignation. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have played it. We'll go now." "No." Madeline grabbed his arm without thinking, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the thin fabric of his uniform. "You can't just— You need to tell me how you know this song. You need to explain—" "Madeline!" Jonathan's voice cut through her desperation like a blade. He was beside her now, his hand on her elbow, his grip tight enough to hurt. "What's going on?" "This man," she said, unable to look away from Ethan's face, "played a song that shouldn't exist." Jonathan laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Darling, you're making a scene. The man played the piano beautifully. It's Christmas Eve. Let's not—" "You don't understand," Madeline interrupted, her voice rising. "That song was written by Marcus Chen. It was his composition, his melody, and it was never finished. He died before—" She stopped because Ethan had gone completely still. At the mention of Marcus's name, something had changed in his expression, a door opening or closing. She couldn't tell which. "You knew him," she said, certainty flooding through her. You knew Marcus. I need to go, Ethan said, backing away. My daughter needs to get home. I'm sorry for any disturbance. It won't happen again. Ethan, Madeline said his name, and it felt strange on her tongue, this sudden intimacy with a stranger. Please, just tell me. What's going on down there? Her father's voice boomed from the balcony, commanding attention the way it always had. Richard Rowe descended the grand staircase like a king descending from his throne, his tuxedo immaculate, his silver hair gleaming in the chandelier light. At 65, he still dominated every room he entered, still controlled Sterling Industries with an iron fist disguised as paternal guidance. Madeline explained this disruption. The maintenance worker played piano, sir, Jonathan said smoothly, his PR voice sliding into place. It was quite moving. Everyone's just a bit overwhelmed by the unexpected entertainment. But Richard's eyes had found Ethan, and something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps concern. You, he said, his voice sharp. What's your name? Ethan Cole, sir, Ethan replied, his voice carefully neutral, but Madeline heard the tension beneath it. I'm with the facilities maintenance team, third shift. I was just leaving. Cole, Richard repeated, his eyes narrowing. Ethan Cole. He was silent for a moment, and Madeline watched her father's face cycle through several expressions before settling on cold dismissal. Yes. You should go. This is a private event. Of course, sir. Ethan adjusted Sophie in his arms, preparing to leave. Wait, Madeline said again, desperation making her reckless. She turned to her father. Do you know him? Have you met him before? Don't be ridiculous, Richard snapped. Why would I know a maintenance worker? But his eyes said something different. His eyes said, drop this, now. Madeline had learned to read her father's expressions over 3 decades of life. She knew his tells, his warnings, the subtle ways he communicated displeasure. And right now, every signal was screaming at her to let this go, to return to the party, to forget about the impossible song and the man who'd played it. But she couldn't. The song he played, she pressed, her voice shaking now. It was Marcus's song, the one he was writing before he died. You remember Marcus, don't you, father? You remember the boy who was going to— That's enough, Richard cut her off, his voice like ice. You're embarrassing yourself, Madeline. And more importantly, you're embarrassing this company. Whatever you think you heard, you're mistaken. Now, I suggest you compose yourself and return to your guests. We have an announcement to make in less than 2 hours. The command in his voice was absolute. This was the man who'd built an empire from his father's small manufacturing company, who'd crushed competitors without mercy, who'd taught Madeline that power was the only currency that mattered. But standing there, looking between her father's closed expression and Ethan's haunted eyes, Madeline felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure in the foundation she'd built her entire adult life on. I need to know, she said quietly, speaking only to Ethan now. Please, just tell me how you knew that song. Sophie stirred in her father's arms, mumbling something incoherent. Ethan looked down at his daughter, and the love on his face was so raw, so unguarded, that Madeline felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time in years. When Ethan looked back up, his expression had hardened into something unreadable. Sometimes songs just exist in the world, Ms. Rowe. They get passed around, remembered, reimagined. Maybe your friend wasn't the only one who thought of those notes. Maybe it's just coincidence. Bullshit, Madeline said, and several people nearby gasped at the CEO's profanity. That's complete bullshit, and you know it. Madeline, Jonathan hissed, mortified, but she ignored him, ignored everyone except the man in front of her. Who are you? She asked. Really? Because you're not just a maintenance worker. The way you played, that takes years of training, dedication. So who are you, and why are you here? For a moment, something flickered in Ethan's eyes, a desire to tell her, perhaps, a need to share the burden of whatever truth he was carrying, but then it was gone, replaced by resigned acceptance. I'm nobody, Ms. Rowe, he said softly. Just someone trying to take care of his daughter, just someone who should have stayed in his place. He took a breath, then added, I'm sorry I disturbed your party. Merry Christmas. He turned and walked away, moving quickly through the crowd that parted for him like water around a stone. Madeline watched him go. Watched the way he held his daughter so carefully, so protectively, as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that everything he'd just said was a lie. "Well," Jonathan said, forcing a laugh, "that was certainly dramatic. Shall we—" "I need a moment," Madeline interrupted, pulling away from him. She turned to Claire, who'd been watching the entire scene with concerned eyes. "Find out everything you can about Ethan Cole. Employment history, background, everything." "Madeline," her father warned. "I mean it, Claire," Madeline continued, ignoring him. "I want a full report by tomorrow morning." "It's Christmas," Claire pointed out gently. "Then I want it the day after Christmas." Claire hesitated, glanced at Richard, then nodded. "All right, I'll see what I can find." "Madeline," Richard said again, his voice dropping into dangerous territory. "A word. In private." It wasn't a request. Madeline followed her father through the crowd, up the grand staircase, into a private office that overlooked the ballroom. Through the windows, she could see the party continuing below, the guests having absorbed the disruption and moved on to other entertainments. But Madeline couldn't shake the image of Ethan's fingers on the piano keys, couldn't unhear the melody that had transported her back 16 years. Richard closed the door, and when he turned to face her, his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "Whatever you're thinking," he said, "stop." "You know him," Madeline said, not bothering to make it a question. "I saw your face when he said his name. You've met him before." "I've met thousands of people," Richard replied dismissively. "I can't be expected to remember every—" "Don't lie to me," Madeline cut him off, her voice sharp. "Not about this." For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other, locked in a battle of wills that had been going on for decades. Finally, Richard sighed, his shoulders dropping slightly. "7 years ago," he said, "a man named Ethan Cole was a rising star in the classical music world. He was young, brilliant, had just signed with one of the major orchestras. He was being called the next great American pianist." Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs. "What happened?" "He had an accident," Richard said flatly. "During a performance at a Sterling Industries-sponsored charity event, a lighting rig fell, crushed his hand, damaged nerves, ended his career." The room seemed to tilt. "Sterling Industries," Madeline repeated. "We were responsible?" "It was an accident," Richard said firmly. "These things happen." "Did we pay him? Compensate him?" Richard's silence was answer enough. "Oh my God," Madeline breathed. "You buried it. You made it go away." "I protected this company," Richard corrected coldly, "as I've always done, as you'll need to do when you fully take over. Sentiment is a luxury, Madeline. Compassion is a weakness. You can't build an empire by caring about every person who suffers a misfortune." Madeline felt sick. "So you just, what? Let him disappear? A man whose career you destroyed?" "His career destroyed itself," Richard snapped. "He should have been more careful. He should have had better insurance. His problems are not my responsibility." "He's working in our building," Madeline said, her voice hollow. "As a maintenance worker. You must have known." "I didn't," Richard admitted. "Not until tonight. He's changed his name, slightly, Cole instead of Coltrane. Avoided any recognition. Smart, actually. If he'd tried to sue, make a fuss, he would have been destroyed. By staying quiet, staying invisible, he's at least got a job." "That's not justice," Madeline whispered. "Justice is a fairy tale," Richard replied. "Power is real. Money is real. Legacy is real. Everything else is just pretty words people tell themselves to feel better about losing." He moved closer, placed a hand on her shoulder in what might have been meant as a paternal gesture, but felt more like a claim of ownership. "You're too much like your mother sometimes," he said, not unkindly. "She had a soft heart too. It's what killed her in the end." Madeline flinched. Her mother had died when she was 24, a heart attack that everyone said came out of nowhere. But Madeline had wondered, in the years since, if it wasn't her mother's heart that had given out, but her spirit, crushed under the weight of a marriage to a man who valued power over everything else. "Forget about Ethan Cole," Richard continued. "Forget about that song. Marcus Chen was a sad story, a talented boy who died too young. But he's gone, Madeline. He's been gone for 16 years. Whatever connection you think exists here, it doesn't matter. What matters is the announcement tonight. The merger. Securing our future. He moved to the door, then paused. And Madeline? If you pursue this, if you dig into Cole's past or start questioning what happened 7 years ago, you'll find nothing but trouble. For him and for us. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let the past stay buried. He left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Madeline alone with the weight of revelations she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. She moved to the window, looking down at the party below. The glittering people, the expensive champagne, the carefully orchestrated celebration of success and power. This was her world. This was everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed for. But somewhere out there, in the cold December night, a man was carrying his sleeping daughter home. A man who'd once been brilliant, whose career had been destroyed by her family's company. A man who somehow knew a song that should have died 16 years ago. A man who, when he'd looked at her, had made her feel something she'd thought she'd buried forever. Not just curiosity, but recognition. Connection. The dangerous possibility that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth sacrificing everything for. Madeline pressed her hand against the cold glass and made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out the truth, no matter what it cost. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and bitter, the kind of cold that seeped through windows and settled into bones. Madeline sat in her penthouse office, the same one where her father had delivered his crushing revelation the night before, surrounded by files that Claire had somehow managed to compile despite the holiday. The efficiency was impressive, but the contents were devastating. Ethan Coltrane, he'd dropped the last syllable when he'd reinvented himself 7 years ago, had been 27 when the accident happened. A graduate of Juilliard, winner of the Tchaikovsky competition, featured in Symphony magazine as one of the 10 young musicians who will define the next generation. His future had been limitless, his talent undeniable. The photographs in the old articles showed a man transformed by passion when he played, his whole body an instrument channeling something transcendent. Then came the Sterling Industries charity gala, a lighting rig inadequately secured, a catastrophic failure during his performance of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. 1,200 pounds of metal and electrical equipment crushing his right hand, severing nerves, pulverizing bone. The medical reports, obtained through channels Madeline didn't want to examine too closely, detailed multiple surgeries, extensive nerve damage, permanent loss of fine motor control. His career hadn't just ended, it had been obliterated. The legal files were worse. Ethan had tried to sue, of course. Any reasonable person would have. But Sterling Industries had an army of lawyers and a bottomless budget for making problems disappear. They'd buried him in motions, delayed proceedings, dragged out depositions until his medical bills exceeded his ability to pay. Eventually, he'd settled for a fraction of what he deserved, just enough to cover his debts, not nearly enough to compensate for a life stolen. The settlement included a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a clause that essentially blacklisted him from performing professionally ever again. They destroyed him twice, once physically, once legally, and the man responsible for orchestrating that destruction had been her father. Madeline closed the last file and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to stop the pressure building behind them. The early morning light filtering through her office windows felt accusatory, exposing every compromise she'd made, every time she'd chosen power over principle because that's what her father had taught her to do. "You look like you haven't slept," Claire said from the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled like they'd been brewed strong enough to strip paint. "I haven't," Madeline admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I've been reading." "I know what's in those files," Claire said quietly, settling into the chair across from Madeline's desk. "I'm the one who compiled them." "Did you know? Before last night, did you know what happened to him?" Claire shook her head. "The settlement was handled by external counsel 7 years ago. It was buried deep, Madeline. Your father made sure of that. I only found it because I knew where to look, or more accurately, where to look for gaps in the record. The absence of information is sometimes more telling than its presence." Madeline took a long drink of coffee, letting the bitter heat ground her. "He has a daughter, Sophie. I saw her birth certificate in the background check. She's 7 years old." "Born 3 months after the accident," Claire confirmed. "Mother's name was Jennifer Cole. She died 4 years ago. Breast cancer. According to medical records, she was diagnosed while pregnant but refused aggressive treatment until after Sophie was born. By then, it was too late. The casual cruelty of that timeline made Madeline's chest ache. Ethan Coltrane had lost his career, his future, and then the woman he'd presumably loved, all while trying to raise a child alone. And through it all, he'd worked maintenance in the building owned by the company that had destroyed his life, invisible to everyone who'd once celebrated his genius. Why would he come back here? Madeline asked. Why work for the company that ruined him? Maybe it's the only place that would hire him, Claire suggested. With the NDA preventing him from discussing what happened, he couldn't exactly explain the gap in his employment history. And with a young child to support, he needed steady work with health insurance. Sterling Industries offers both. So he swallowed his pride and took a job scrubbing toilets in the same building where he once performed for Manhattan's elite. Madeline set down her coffee cup with enough force to make it rattle. That's not pride swallowing, Claire. That's systematic humiliation. What are you going to do? Claire asked, watching her carefully. Madeline didn't answer immediately. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the streets below where early morning workers were beginning to fill the sidewalks, anonymous and invisible to the people in the towers above them. How many of them had stories like Ethan's? How many had been chewed up and spit out by companies like Sterling Industries, their suffering carefully documented in sealed legal files and then forgotten? I'm going to talk to him, she said finally. Madeline, your father specifically told you. I know what my father told me, Madeline interrupted, her voice sharp. I also know what I heard last night. That song, Claire. It wasn't just any melody. It was the song Marcus was writing before he died. The song that was supposed to be mine. Claire was silent for a moment, then asked gently, have you considered that maybe it's not the same song? That maybe you're hearing what you want to hear because you're not happy and you're looking for a reason to disrupt your life? I'm not unhappy, Madeline said automatically. You're marrying a man you don't love because your father arranged it. You're taking over a company that apparently destroys people for profit. You don't see your friends anymore. Not that you had many to begin with. You work 16-hour days and measure your worth in quarterly earnings. Claire's voice was soft but relentless. If that's not unhappy, I don't know what is. Madeline turned from the window, her expression carefully controlled. My personal feelings are irrelevant. I have responsibilities. To whom? Your father? Jonathan? Shareholders who don't know your name and wouldn't care if they did? Claire stood, crossing to stand beside Madeline at the window. Or to yourself? To the person you were before you decided feelings were inefficient and love was for people who could afford vulnerability? That person was weak, Madeline said, but her voice wavered. That person let a boy's death nearly destroy her. That person spent 2 years barely functioning, barely existing, because she couldn't accept that someone she loved was gone. That person was 19 and grieving, Claire corrected. That person was human. Madeline closed her eyes, and for just a moment, she let herself remember. Marcus Chen had been everything her father wasn't. Warm, passionate, alive in a way that made the world seem full of possibility rather than threat. He'd been a year ahead of her at Columbia, a music major who'd played piano at a coffee shop where she'd gone to escape her father's expectations for a few hours each week. She'd been studying business because that's what road children did. But in those stolen evenings listening to Marcus play, she'd let herself imagine a different life. The song he'd been writing for her had been their secret, something he'd worked on between classes and performances, his gift to her for their first anniversary. She'd loved him with the kind of intensity only first love allows, the kind that believes in forever, despite all evidence that nothing lasts. And then he'd died. A drunk driver, a wet road, an intersection where fate decided that 19 years was all Marcus Chen would get. The song had died with him, unfinished, taking with it every possibility she'd imagined. Or so she'd thought. I need to know how Ethan knows that song, Madeline said, opening her eyes. I need to understand the connection, and I need to look that man in the eye and acknowledge what my family's company did to him. Your father will fight you on this, Claire warned. Then I'll fight back, Madeline replied. For once in my life, I'll fight back. She gathered the files, shoving them into her leather briefcase with hands that shook slightly, from exhaustion, from coffee, from the weight of decisions she was only beginning to understand. Where does he live? Claire pulled out her phone, pulling up an address. Queens, A walk up in Astoria, not exactly the Upper East Side. I'm going there, Madeline decided. Now? It's barely 7 in the morning, and it's the day after Christmas. Which means he won't be at work, which means I can talk to him without security cameras recording every word. Madeline grabbed her coat, a long black cashmere that had cost more than Ethan probably made in a month. If anyone asks, I'm taking the day off. You never take days off, Claire pointed out. Then I'm overdue. 20 minutes later, Madeline sat in the back of her town car, watching as Manhattan's gleaming towers gave way to the more modest buildings of Queens. Her driver, Marcus, ironically named, she thought, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, clearly confused by their destination. She didn't explain. She wasn't sure she could. Astoria in winter looked tired, she thought. The Christmas decorations on storefronts seemed more obligatory than joyful, the streets scattered with dirty snow that had been beautiful when it fell, but had since become just another thing to navigate around. The building where Ethan lived was narrow, squeezed between a bodega and a laundromat, its brick facade marked by generations of weather and neglect. Ma'am, Marcus the driver said hesitantly, are you sure about this address? I'm sure, Madeline replied, though she wasn't sure of anything anymore. She climbed out of the car, immediately feeling overdressed in her designer coat and Louboutin boots. The cold hit her harder here than it did in Manhattan, something about the wind tunneling between buildings, finding every gap in her clothing. She'd grown soft, she realized, insulated by wealth and privilege from the discomfort most people lived with daily. The building's entrance was locked, its intercom a collection of buttons with names handwritten on faded tape. She found E. Cole listed for apartment 4B and pressed the button, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Silence. She pressed again. Finally, a crackling voice came through the speaker. Yes? Mr. Cole? It's Madeline Rowe, from last night. I need to speak with you. A longer silence, then, Ms. Rowe. I don't think that's appropriate. I'm sorry I disrupted your event. It won't happen again. I'm not here about the disruption, Madeline said, her breath fogging in the cold air. I'm here about the song. Please, 5 minutes. She could hear the hesitation through the intercom, could imagine him standing in his apartment weighing his options. Finally, the buzzer sounded and the lock clicked open. The stairwell smelled like decades of cooking, cleaning products, and lives lived in close proximity. Madeline climbed 4 flights, her boots echoing on worn linoleum, passing doors behind which she could hear morning televisions, crying babies, someone singing off-key. This was Ethan's world now, she thought. This was how far he'd fallen. Apartment 4B's door opened before she could knock. Ethan stood in the doorway, and in the morning light without the formal party atmosphere, she could see him more clearly. He wore faded jeans and a gray sweatshirt, his feet bare, his hair uncombed. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond one sleepless night. This was the exhaustion of years, of carrying burdens alone, of surviving when thriving was no longer an option. But his eyes were alert, wary, and when they met hers, she felt that same jolt of recognition she'd felt the night before. Ms. Rowe, he said, his voice carefully neutral. This is unexpected. May I come in? She asked. He hesitated, glancing back into the apartment where she could hear the sound of morning cartoons playing. My daughter is here. I remember. Sophie, right? Something flickered across his face at her use of his daughter's name. Protectiveness, maybe, or concern about why the CEO of Sterling Industries would know or care about a maintenance worker's child. 5 minutes, he said finally, stepping back to let her in. The apartment was small, maybe 600 square feet divided into a living area that doubled as a dining room, a tiny kitchen, and what she assumed was a bedroom and bathroom beyond. But it was meticulously clean and filled with signs of a life carefully built from whatever materials were available. Sophie's drawings covered one wall, held up with tape that was probably purchased because it wouldn't damage the paint. Books lined makeshift shelves made from boards and cinder blocks. A small keyboard, not a real piano, but a cheap electronic substitute, sat in the corner, its keys worn from use. Sophie was curled up on a worn couch, watching cartoons on a television that had to be a decade old. She looked up when Madeline entered, her eyes going wide. It's the pretty lady from the party, she said, bouncing up. Daddy, it's the lady who let us see the tree. Yes, Princess, Ethan said softly. Ms. Rowe came to talk to Daddy for a few minutes. Can you watch your show while we talk in the kitchen? Sophie nodded enthusiastically, but her eyes stayed on Madeline with open curiosity. Are you a princess? You look like a princess. Despite everything, Madeline found herself smiling. No, sweetheart, I'm just a businesswoman. That's boring, Sophie declared with the brutal honesty of children. Princesses are better. Sophie, Ethan said, gentle reproach in his voice. She's right, Madeline said. Princesses are definitely better. She followed Ethan into the kitchen, which was barely large enough for both of them to stand without touching. He filled a kettle and set it on the stove, a gesture of hospitality that seemed automatic despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. I don't have much to offer you, he said, his back to her as he retrieved two mismatched mugs from a cabinet. Tea is about it. Tea is fine, Madeline said, though she knew she wouldn't drink it. She was here for answers, not refreshments. Mr. Cole, Ethan, he interrupted, still not turning. If we're going to do this, you might as well use my first name. Mr. Cole feels like a joke considering where we're standing. Ethan, she began again. I know what happened to you 7 years ago. His shoulders stiffened, his hand freezing in the act of reaching for tea bags. I signed an NDA, Ms. Rowe. I can't discuss that. I'm not here to enforce the NDA. I'm here to apologize. He turned then, his expression carefully blank. Apologize? For what my family's company did to you, for the accident, for the inadequate settlement, for destroying your career and then trying to bury you in legal paperwork so you couldn't fight back. The words came out in a rush, propelled by guilt and anger at a system she'd benefited from without questioning. What happened to you was unconscionable, and I'm sorry. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, a short, bitter sound. You're apologizing? You? Personally? I'm the CEO, Madeline said. The company's actions are my responsibility. You weren't the CEO 7 years ago, Ethan pointed out. You weren't even working for Sterling Industries yet, were you? You were still in graduate school. The fact that he knew this about her, that he'd tracked her career at least peripherally, sent a strange thrill through her that she immediately tried to suppress. That doesn't absolve me of responsibility for what the company did. No, Ethan agreed, but it does make your apology somewhat hollow. You didn't make those decisions. You didn't sign off on the inadequate safety inspections or the legal strategy that crushed me. Your father did. And I've spent the last 8 years implementing his vision for the company, Madeline countered. I've made similar decisions, prioritized profit over people, convinced myself that was just how business worked. So yes, I'm complicit. And yes, my apology matters, whether you accept it or not. The kettle began to whistle. Ethan turned off the heat but didn't pour the water, just stood there with his damaged hand. She could see it now, the way he held it differently than his left. The slight tremor, the scars visible at his wrist, braced against the counter. Why are you really here? He asked quietly. It's not just about what happened to me 7 years ago. It's about the song. Yes, Madeline admitted. The song. I told you last night. You lied to me last night, she interrupted. That song was written by Marcus Chen. I know because I was there when he wrote it. I watched him compose every note. It was supposed to be his gift to me, his girlfriend, for our first anniversary, but he died 3 weeks before he could finish it. Ethan's expression shifted, became something unreadable. Marcus Chen, he repeated. You knew him, Madeline said, certain now. That's the connection I couldn't figure out. You knew Marcus, and somehow you learned his song. For a long moment, Ethan didn't respond. She could see him weighing options, calculating risks, deciding how much truth he could afford to share. Finally, he sighed, a sound of defeat or perhaps relief. I didn't just know him, Ethan said quietly. He was my best friend. The kitchen seemed to tilt. Madeline reached out to steady herself against the refrigerator, its surface covered with Sophie's artwork and alphabet magnets. Your best friend, she repeated. We met at a summer music program when we were 14, Ethan continued, his voice distant, remembering. We were roommates, competitors, brothers by choice if not by blood. We pushed each other, inspired each other, drove each other crazy. When we got into Juilliard together, we thought we'd conquer the world. Marcus went to Columbia, Madeline said, confused. He was a music major at Columbia. He transferred, Ethan said, after his first year at Juilliard. He said he wanted a broader education, wanted to understand more than just music. But I always thought... He stopped, shook his head. I always thought he left because of his father, because the pressure at Juilliard was too intense, and his father's expectations were crushing him. Madeline felt like she was standing on shifting ground. Marcus had never mentioned transferring from Juilliard, never mentioned a best friend named Ethan. But then again, they'd only known each other for 8 months before he died. 8 intense, consuming months where they'd been so focused on each other that the rest of the world had faded to background noise. He was writing that song the last time I saw him, Ethan continued, a week before he died. We met at a diner near campus, and he played me what he had so far on his phone. He was so excited about it, said it was the most important thing he'd ever written because it was for you, for Maddie. Hearing Marcus's nickname for her in Ethan's voice made her throat tight. He told you about me? He told me everything about you, Ethan said, and there was something in his tone, sadness maybe, or regret. How you made him laugh, how you saw him as more than just his music, how you were the first person who made him feel like he could be both an artist and a human being, not just a performing machine for his father's ambitions. Then why didn't I ever meet you? Madeline asked. If you were his best friend, why weren't you at his funeral? Why didn't you reach out after? Ethan's jaw tightened. Because by the time he died, we weren't speaking. We'd had a fight, stupid and petty, about music and competition and ego. I said things I didn't mean. He said things he probably did mean. We were 19 and convinced we had all the time in the world to fix it. He looked away, his voice rough. And then we didn't. And then he was gone. And I never got to tell him I was sorry. The pain in his voice was so raw that Madeline felt it echo in her own chest. She'd spent 16 years mourning Marcus, but she'd never considered that there might be others who'd loved him too, who'd lost him too, whose grief was just as valid as her own. So you finished the song, she said softly. For him. For both of us, Ethan corrected. It took me years. I'd work on it between performances, trying to hear what he would have done, how he would have wanted it to end. It became an obsession, a way to keep him alive, a way to apologize for things I could never say to his face. And then you lost everything, Madeline continued, the pieces falling into place. Your career, your ability to perform, but you still had the song. It's all I had, Ethan admitted. The song, and later, my daughter. The song became Sophie's lullaby because it was the only way I could still connect to music, to Marcus, to the person I used to be before. He gestured vaguely with his damaged hand, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. They stood in the tiny kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated weight of loss and grief and years of buried truth. In the living room, Sophie's cartoon played on, cheerful voices selling cereal and toys to children who didn't yet know how fragile happiness could be. Why didn't you tell me this last night? Madeline asked. Because I'm nobody, Ethan said, echoing his words from the party. Because you're the CEO of the company that destroyed my life, engaged to a man who'd crush me without a second thought if I became inconvenient. Because I have a daughter to protect, and I can't afford to make waves or draw attention or do anything except keep my head down and survive. He met her eyes, his own filled with exhaustion and resignation. Because telling you the truth doesn't change anything, Ms. Rowe. It just opens old wounds for both of us. Don't call me that, Madeline said, the word surprising her. My name is Madeline, or Maddie. Marcus called me Maddie. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. I know. He told me. The sound of small feet running interrupted them. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding her worn, stuffed rabbit. Daddy, I'm hungry. Can we have pancakes? Of course, Princess, Ethan said, his voice instantly softening. He glanced at Madeline. I should... Let me help, Madeline offered, then realized how absurd that sounded. She didn't cook. She had staff for that. The last time she'd made pancakes had been, she couldn't even remember. But Sophie clapped her hands together. Yes, the princess can help. And somehow, impossibly, Madeline found herself standing in a kitchen barely large enough to turn around in, watching as Ethan mixed pancake batter with practiced ease while Sophie chattered about her Christmas presents. A coloring book, new crayons, a stuffed animal from the Salvation Army that she'd named Mr. Whiskers, even though it was clearly a dog. "We don't have much," Ethan said quietly as he poured batter onto a griddle. "But Sophie doesn't know that. To her, every gift is magic." "She's lucky to have you," Madeline said, and meant it. "I'm lucky to have her," Ethan corrected. "After Jennifer died, Sophie was the only thing that kept me going. The only reason I got out of bed, went to work, kept trying. She saved my life." They ate together, the three of them, crowded around a table meant for two. Sophie talked nonstop, telling stories about school and friends, and a field trip to a museum where she'd seen paintings that looked like someone spilled their feelings. Ethan listened with the patient attention of a parent who knew these moments were finite, who'd learned to treasure the ordinary because he'd lost so much of the extraordinary. And Madeline, who hadn't shared a meal with someone outside of a business context in longer than she could remember, found herself laughing at Sophie's observations, moved by the easy affection between father and daughter, struck by how much life existed in this small apartment that her penthouse, for all its luxury, lacked entirely. When breakfast was finished and Sophie had gone back to her cartoons, Ethan walked Madeline to the door. They stood in the narrow hallway, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of beard stubble on his jaw, the way he held his damaged hand protectively against his chest, as if it still hurt after all these years. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Madeline admitted. "I came here looking for answers and I found them, but I also found more questions." "Such as?" "Such as why a man with your talent is wasting it scrubbing floors instead of teaching music, playing in some capacity, sharing what you know with people who need it." "The settlement agreement prohibits me from professional performance," Ethan reminded her. "Then I'll void the agreement," Madeline said, the decision forming as she spoke. "I'll have our legal department draw up new terms. Compensation that actually reflects what you lost. The freedom to teach, to play, to rebuild whatever career you want." Ethan stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's right," Madeline said simply. "Because what my father's company did to you was wrong. Because I have the power to fix this, at least partially, and if I don't use that power, then what's the point of having it? Your father won't allow it." "My father doesn't control me," Madeline said, though she wasn't sure if that was true or just something she desperately wanted to be true. "And your fiancé? Jonathan Sterling? I saw his face last night when you were talking to me. He's not going to be happy about the CEO of his family's company taking a personal interest in a maintenance worker." "Jonathan doesn't control me either," Madeline said with more certainty. That at least she knew was true. Ethan reached out, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "Be careful, Madeline. People like your father, like Jonathan, they don't let go of power easily. If you start changing the rules, if you start questioning the system that keeps them in control, there will be consequences." "I know," Madeline said. "I'm counting on it." She left before she could second-guess herself, descending the 4 flights of stairs with legs that felt unsteady, emerging into the gray morning light to find her driver waiting patiently by the car. He opened the door for her, his expression neutral, but she knew he'd report this visit to someone. Maybe her father, maybe Jonathan. Privacy was an illusion when you were powerful. Someone was always watching, always reporting, always calculating advantage. Let them watch, Madeline thought, as the car pulled away from the curb. Let them calculate. For the first time in years, she was done playing by their rules. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jonathan. "Where are you? Your father is looking for you. The merger announcement is today. We need to discuss strategy." She silenced the phone without responding. Another text, this one from Claire. "Just a heads up, your father knows you went to Queens, his head of security tracked your car. He's not happy." Madeline smiled grimly. Of course he knew. Richard Rowe always knew everything. That's how he maintained control, through information, through surveillance, through making sure every person in his orbit understood that privacy was a privilege he could revoke at any moment. But knowing where she'd gone and understanding why she'd gone were two different things. Her father thought he understood her, thought he'd shaped her into his perfect successor, a woman who would prioritize profit over people just as he did. He was about to learn how wrong he was. By the time Madeline reached her penthouse, she'd made several decisions. She called her lawyer, not Sterling Industries' legal team, but her personal attorney, a woman she trusted to prioritize ethics over expedience. She authorized a full review of Ethan Coltrane's settlement agreement and instructed her lawyer to begin drafting terms for a new arrangement. She called the head of human resources and arranged for Ethan to be transferred to a different position, something that would use his skills, pay appropriately, and get him out of maintenance where every day was a humiliation. And then, because she was already burning bridges, she called her father. "Where the hell have you been?" Richard demanded without preamble. "The merger announcement is in 4 hours, and you're nowhere to be found." "I needed to take care of something," Madeline said calmly. "Something more important than the biggest deal in Sterling Industries' history?" "Yes, actually." The silence on the other end was shocked. In 34 years, Madeline had never prioritized anything over business. "This is about that maintenance worker," Richard said finally, his voice dangerous. "About Ethan Cole." "His name is Coltrane," Madeline corrected. "Ethan Coltrane. And yes, it's about him. It's about the fact that our company destroyed his career and then buried him in legal paperwork to avoid taking responsibility." "We've been through this," Richard snapped. "What happened was an accident. We settled it. It's over." "It's not over for him," Madeline shot back. "He spent 7 years working as a janitor in the building where he used to perform because we took everything from him and left him with no options." "He had options. He chose not to pursue them. Because you made sure any option except silence would destroy him completely." Madeline's voice rose despite her intention to stay calm. "You didn't just hurt him, Dad. You systematically broke him down until accepting our insulting settlement was the only way he could survive." "That's business, Madeline. Sometimes people get hurt. That's not our responsibility." "Then maybe it should be," Madeline said. "Maybe we should be the kind of company that takes responsibility instead of hiding behind lawyers and NDAs." "You're being emotional," Richard said, his tone dismissive. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. This is exactly what I worried about, that you'd be too much like your mother, too soft to make the hard decisions that keep this company strong." The comparison to her mother, meant as an insult, instead felt like a benediction. "Maybe Mom was right," Madeline said quietly. "Maybe there are things more important than being strong. Maybe there are things worth more than power and profit." "Like what? Love?" Richard's laugh was harsh. "Look where love got your mother, dead at 52 from the stress of trying to fix a world that didn't want to be fixed. Is that what you want? To waste your potential on pointless compassion?" "I want," Madeline said carefully, "to be able to look at myself in the mirror and not see someone who sacrifices people for quarterly earnings. I want to build something that lasts, not because it's powerful, but because it's good. And I want to stop pretending that the way we've always done things is the only way things can be done." "You're making a mistake," Richard warned. "Probably," Madeline agreed. "But it's my mistake to make." She hung up before he could respond, her heart pounding, her hands shaking with adrenaline and fear, and something that might have been liberation. She'd just declared war on her father, on everything he'd built, on the empire she was supposed to inherit and expand, and it felt terrifying, and it felt right. Her phone rang again immediately. Jonathan this time. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. "Madeline, your father is furious. I don't know what you said to him, but you need to fix this before the announcement tonight. Our families have worked too hard on this merger to let it fall apart because you're having some kind of crisis. Call me back." She deleted the message. The rest of the day passed in a blur of decisions and consequences. Her lawyer confirmed that Ethan's settlement agreement was unconscionable and would likely be thrown out if challenged in court. The HR department arranged for his transfer, though they clearly thought she'd lost her mind. Claire sent a steady stream of updates. Her father was calling an emergency board meeting, Jonathan was threatening to postpone the engagement announcement, industry reporters were starting to ask questions about internal turmoil at Sterling Industries. Let them ask, Madeline thought. Let them dig. Maybe it was time for the truth to come out. As evening approached, she received one more call, this time from a number she didn't recognize. She answered warily. "Ms. Rowe?" It was Ethan, his voice uncertain. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just received a call from HR. They said I'm being transferred to a new position. They said you authorized it." "I did," Madeline confirmed. "Why?" "Because you shouldn't be a janitor," she said simply. "Because you have skills this company needs, and it's criminally wasteful to ignore them." "This is going to cause you trouble," Ethan said. "I heard your father on the news just now. He said there would be a major announcement tonight about leadership changes at Sterling Industries." "That doesn't sound good." Madeline looked out her penthouse window at the city spreading below her, all those lights representing all those lives, people struggling and surviving and occasionally, briefly, thriving. Somewhere out there, in a walk-up apartment in Queens, a little girl was probably getting ready for bed, maybe asking her father to play the sleeping song one more time. "It's not good," Madeline admitted, "but that doesn't mean it's wrong." "I don't understand you," Ethan said quietly. "You have everything: power, money, position. Why would you risk all that for someone you barely know?" "Because," Madeline said, 16 years ago, I lost someone I loved. And I spent the next decade and a half trying to convince myself that love was a weakness, that caring about people was dangerous, that the only way to survive was to build walls so high that nothing could hurt me." She paused, gathering courage. "But last night, you played a song that shouldn't exist, a song that reminded me of who I used to be before I armored myself in ice and ambition, and I realized that I've been surviving, but I haven't been living. And maybe it's time to change that." Ethan was silent for so long that she thought he might have hung up. Finally, he said, "That song is about hope, you know. That's what Marcus told me he was trying to capture. The feeling of believing that tomorrow could be better than today, that love could transform ordinary moments into something transcendent." "Did he succeed?" Madeline asked. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I finished it, but I was finishing it from a place of grief and loss, not hope. Maybe that changed what it was supposed to be." "Or maybe," Madeline suggested, "it made it more honest, because hope doesn't exist without grief. We can't appreciate light without knowing darkness." "That's very philosophical for a CEO." "I used to read philosophy," Madeline said, "before I decided it was impractical and stopped letting myself have interests that didn't advance my career." "What happened to that person?" Ethan asked gently. "She got scared," Madeline said, "and she spent 16 years hiding, but I hope, she's ready to stop hiding now." After they hung up, Madeline got dressed for the evening's announcement, but instead of the severe black she usually wore, she chose a dress her mother had loved, deep blue silk that moved like water, elegant without being aggressive. She left her hair down instead of pulled back. She wore the pearl earrings her mother had given her instead of the diamonds Jonathan preferred. Small rebellions, but they mattered. The announcement was being held in Sterling Industries' main conference hall, with representatives from Blackwood Technologies, board members, major shareholders, and select press in attendance. When Madeline arrived, she could feel the tension crackling through the air. Her father stood with Jonathan and the Blackwood executives, his expression thunderous. When he saw her, his eyes narrowed. "We need to talk," he said, grabbing her elbow with bruising force. "Now!" He pulled her into an empty office, closing the door behind them. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "This merger is happening, Madeline. The contracts are signed. The press releases are ready. You don't get to torpedo this because you've suddenly developed a conscience." "I'm not torpedoing anything," Madeline said calmly. "I'm simply suggesting that we need to reevaluate our priorities as a company." "By starting with that pianist? By dragging up a settled case and making us look weak?" "By acknowledging our mistakes and taking responsibility for them," Madeline corrected. "By being the kind of company that people can be proud to work for instead of afraid of." "You sound like your mother," Richard spat. "Good," Madeline replied, "because Mom was a better person than either of us has ever been." Her father's expression shifted, became something calculating. "If you do this," he said quietly, "if you go through with whatever noble crusade you're planning, you'll lose everything. I'll remove you as CEO. I'll make sure no other major company in this city will hire you. You'll be throwing away your entire career for what? A man you don't know? A song that means nothing? It doesn't mean nothing, Madeline said. It means everything. The conference hall felt like a courtroom, and Madeline knew she was about to stand trial. 200 faces turned toward her as she entered, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. The Blackwood Technologies executives sat in the front row, their expensive suits and practiced smiles masking whatever calculations ran beneath. Board members whispered behind hands, already choosing sides in a conflict that hadn't yet been publicly declared. And Jonathan stood beside her father on the stage, his jaw tight, his eyes promising consequences. Madeline walked down the center aisle with her head high, each step deliberate, refusing to let them see the terror racing through her bloodstream. She'd spent her entire adult life in rooms like this, commanding respect through competence and controlled aggression. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she wasn't sure she wanted their respect if it meant maintaining the lies that had built this empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of decades at the helm, "thank you for joining us on this historic evening. As you know, Sterling Industries has been in negotiations with Blackwood Technologies for the past 18 months, working toward a merger that will—" "Before we proceed," Madeline interrupted, her voice cutting through her father's prepared remarks like a blade through silk. The room went silent. No one interrupted Richard Rowe. No one, not even his daughter. Richard's eyes found hers across the distance, filled with warning and barely suppressed rage. "Madeline, this isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," she continued, moving toward the stage with measured steps. "Because before we announce a merger that will expand our influence and increase our profit margins, I think everyone in this room deserves to know what kind of company Sterling Industries actually is." "Sit down," Richard hissed, but his microphone picked up the words, broadcasting his anger to everyone present. Madeline climbed the stairs to the stage, taking a position beside her father. Up close, she could see the rage burning behind his controlled expression, the calculation as he weighed his options. Force her off the stage and look tyrannical, or let her speak and risk whatever truth she was about to reveal. 7 years ago, Madeline began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. At a Sterling Industries charity gala, a lighting rig fell on a young pianist named Ethan Coltrane. The accident severed nerves in his hand, ended his career, and destroyed his life. Our company's response was not to take responsibility, but to bury him in legal motions until he accepted a settlement that barely covered his medical bills. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. The press representatives in the back began typing furiously on their phones. "Madeline," Jonathan said, stepping forward, his smile strained, "I'm sure whatever point you're trying to make can wait until after—" "It can't wait," Madeline cut him off. "It's waited 7 years already. It's waited through every quarterly report where we celebrated record profits while Ethan Coltrane worked as a maintenance worker in this very building, invisible to everyone who'd once celebrated his genius." "This is ancient history," Richard interjected, trying to regain control. "A settled legal matter that has nothing to do with tonight's announcement." "It has everything to do with it," Madeline countered. "Because the merger you're about to announce, the expansion you're so proud of, it's all built on the same principle. That profit matters more than people. That we can take what we want and bury the consequences in paperwork and legal threats." She turned to face the audience directly, seeing Claire in the third row, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. Seeing the Blackwood executives exchanging glances, reassessing the company they were about to merge with. Seeing the board members who held her future in their hands, whose votes could destroy her career in the next 24 hours. "I'm not saying Sterling Industries is uniquely evil," Madeline continued. "We're not. We're just typical. We're just one more company that's decided the only thing that matters is winning, no matter who gets hurt in the process. And I'm saying that maybe, finally, it's time to ask ourselves if that's really the legacy we want to build." "Enough," Richard said, his voice like iron. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You're relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Security, escort Ms. Rowe from the building." But before the security guards could move, a voice from the back of the room called out, "Let her finish." Everyone turned. Ethan Coltrane stood in the doorway, still wearing his maintenance uniform, His damaged hand held carefully at his side. Beside him, Claire stood with her arms crossed, having apparently retrieved him from wherever he'd been working his shift. "Mr. Coltrane," Richard said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "this is a private corporate event. You need to leave." "With respect, sir," Ethan said, moving down the aisle with quiet dignity, "Ms. Rowe was talking about me. I think that gives me the right to be here." He reached the stage, climbing the stairs despite the security guards moving to intercept him. But Madeline stepped between them, using her body as a shield, and the guards hesitated, unsure whether to physically remove both the CEO and a maintenance worker in front of 200 witnesses. "Tell them," Madeline said to Ethan, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "tell them what really happened." "If I do this," Ethan replied quietly, "there's no going back. For either of us." "I know." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something passing between them. Understanding, perhaps, or shared recognition of a cliff they were about to jump off together. Then he turned to face the crowd. "My name is Ethan Coltrane," he began, his voice carrying despite its quietness. 7 years ago, I was a concert pianist. I'd graduated from Juilliard, won the Tchaikovsky competition, signed with the New York Philharmonic. I had a future. He paused, lifting his damaged hand. And then I came to a Sterling Industries event and played Rachmaninoff. And then a lighting rig that hadn't been properly secured fell on me. And then my future ended. The room was completely silent now. Every eye on this man in a maintenance uniform who spoke with the educated precision of someone who'd once commanded stages and critics' respect. "The pain was extraordinary," Ethan continued. "Not just the physical pain of crushed bones and severed nerves, but the pain of watching everything I'd worked for since I was 6 years old disappear in an instant. The surgeries didn't help. The physical therapy didn't help. My hand was destroyed, and with it, my ability to perform at the level required for professional classical music." He moved to the piano that sat on the stage, the same one from the Christmas party, Madeline realized, moved here for tonight's event. His fingers touched the keys with a gentleness that spoke of loss and longing. "But worse than losing my career was what came after," Ethan said. "When I tried to seek compensation, Sterling Industries buried me in legal motions. They delayed, they obfuscated, they made it clear that fighting them would cost more than I could ever afford. They waited until my medical bills exceeded my ability to pay, until I was desperate, and then they offered me a settlement that was a fraction of what I'd lost. And they made me sign an agreement promising I'd never speak about what happened, never perform professionally again, never do anything that might remind the world that Sterling Industries had destroyed a young artist's life." Richard's face had gone red. "That's a violation of your NDA. I'll have you in court by morning." "Go ahead," Ethan said calmly. "Sue me. Drag this into public court where journalists can report on every detail. Let's put the safety records from that event on display. Let's examine the inspection reports that were falsified, the warnings that were ignored, the cost-cutting measures that made that accident inevitable." "You have no proof of any of that," Jonathan interjected, but his voice wavered slightly. "Actually," a new voice said from the audience, "he does." A woman in her 50s stood, holding a folder. Madeline recognized her as Patricia Chen, head of the building's engineering department, someone who'd worked for Sterling Industries for 3 decades. "I was the site supervisor for that event," Patricia continued. "I filed 3 separate reports about inadequate safety measures. I was told to stop making waves or find a new job. After the accident, those reports disappeared from the system, but I kept copies." She walked to the stage, handing the folder to Madeline. Inside were dated, signed reports detailing exactly the kind of negligence that could destroy a company's reputation and result in massive liability. Richard's expression shifted from rage to calculation. "Patricia, you're fired. Effective immediately." "You can't fire her for telling the truth," Madeline said, clutching the folder. "I can fire her for anything I want," Richard shot back. "Just as I can fire you. Just as I can make sure both of you never work in this industry again." "Try it," Madeline challenged. "Fire me in front of 200 witnesses, including journalists. Fire Patricia for producing evidence of corporate malfeasance. See how that plays in tomorrow's headlines." The standoff stretched. tension crackling like electricity through the conference hall. The Blackwood executives were whispering urgently among themselves. Board members were making phone calls. The journalists were practically salivating at the story unfolding before them. Finally, Jonathan stepped forward, his PR instincts overriding his anger. "Everyone, please," he said, his voice smooth. "Let's all calm down. This is clearly an emotional situation, but it doesn't need to derail tonight's announcement. We can address these historical concerns through proper channels while moving forward with—" "There's more," Madeline interrupted. She pulled out her phone, pulling up the files Claire had compiled. "Ethan's case isn't isolated. In the past decade, Sterling Industries has settled 17 similar cases: workplace accidents, environmental violations, labor disputes, and in every case, we've used our legal resources and financial power to force settlements that prioritized our bottom line over people's lives." She began reading names, dates, details. A warehouse worker paralyzed in a forklift accident because safety equipment wasn't maintained. A community in New Jersey suffering increased cancer rates near one of their manufacturing plants. Employees fired for reporting sexual harassment. Each case a story of suffering, each one carefully buried under legal paperwork and gag orders. "Stop," Richard commanded, his voice shaking with rage. "You're destroying this company." "No," Madeline said, meeting his eyes. "You destroyed this company. You turned it into something that profits from other people's pain. I'm just finally admitting what it's become." "You naive little fool," Richard snarled, all pretense of control abandoned. "You think these people care about your moral awakening? You think truth matters more than power? You're going to lose everything, your position, your inheritance, your fiancé. And for what? For him?" He gestured at Ethan with contempt. "For some broken pianist who can't even play anymore?" "I can play," Ethan said quietly. "Not like I used to, not at the level required for professional performance, but I can still play." He sat at the piano, positioning his hands over the keys. "The hand doesn't work right," he explained to the room. "The nerves are damaged. Some fingers don't respond the way they should, but I spent 7 years learning to play differently, to compensate, to find new ways to create music even with limitations." He began to play, and the melody that emerged was Marcus's song, Madeline's song, but different now, transformed by Ethan's damaged hand and hard-won skill. Where the Christmas Eve performance had been smooth and technically perfect, this version had rough edges, moments where his hand couldn't quite execute what his mind envisioned. But those imperfections made it more beautiful, more human, more honest about the cost of survival. The room listened, transfixed. Even Richard stood silent, his rage momentarily suspended by the power of what he was hearing. When the last notes faded, Ethan lifted his hands from the keys and turned to face the audience. "That song was written by my best friend, Marcus Chen, for the woman he loved. He died before he could finish it, and I spent years completing it, trying to honor his vision while adding my own. It became my daughter's lullaby, the one thing connecting me to the person I used to be." He looked at Madeline. When Ms. Rowe heard it at the Christmas party, she recognized it, because she was the woman Marcus loved. She was his Maddie, and when she came to my apartment yesterday and demanded answers, she could have just taken the information and walked away. She could have maintained the comfortable distance between CEO and maintenance worker, but instead she chose to see me as a person, to acknowledge that what happened to me mattered, and that choice, that simple recognition of my humanity, that's what changed everything. Jonathan laughed, a harsh sound. "How touching. The CEO and the janitor, united by a dead boy's song. This is pathetic, Madeline. You're throwing away an empire for sentimentality." "Then maybe the empire deserves to be thrown away," Madeline replied. "The board won't support you," Richard warned. "They'll vote to remove you, and without your position, you're nothing, just another wealthy girl with more conscience than sense." "Then let them vote," Madeline said. She turned to the board members in the audience. "I'm not asking you to choose between profit and principles. I'm asking you to consider whether we can build something better than what we've been. Whether Sterling Industries can be a company that succeeds not by crushing people, but by lifting them up. Whether we can compete and win while still maintaining our integrity." "That's a fantasy," one of the older board members called out. "Business doesn't work that way." "It can," Madeline countered. There are companies doing exactly that. Patagonia, Costco, companies that pay living wages and treat employees with dignity and still generate substantial returns. It's not a fantasy. It's just a choice we've been too afraid or too greedy to make. And if we make that choice? Another board member asked. If we follow your vision, what happens to our stock price, our quarterly earnings? Honestly, they might drop initially, Madeline admitted. Doing the right thing often costs money in the short term. But in the long term, we'd build something sustainable, something people want to work for, invest in, support, something we can be proud of instead of just profitable at. I've heard enough, Richard declared. He turned to the board members. I'm calling for an emergency vote to remove Madeline as CEO, effective immediately. All in favor? Wait, a voice interrupted. Harold Blackwood, CEO of the company they were supposed to be merging with, stood. He was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, with white hair and sharp eyes that had witnessed decades of corporate warfare. Before anyone votes on anything, I'd like to say something. He walked to the stage with slow, deliberate steps. I've been in this business for 50 years, he began. I've built my company through the same methods Richard Rowe used to build his: aggressive competition, strategic litigation, prioritizing profit above all else. And you know what I've learned? Success tastes like ash when you're standing on a pile of bodies to achieve it. He turned to Richard. I came here tonight prepared to shake your hand and merge our companies. But after what I've heard, after watching your daughter have the courage to stand up and tell the truth about corporate practices that every person in this room knows exist but pretends don't matter, I'm withdrawing from the merger. Richard's face went pale. Harold, you can't. The contracts are signed. The contracts have a moral turpitude clause, Harold replied. Evidence of systematic negligence and cover-ups constitutes grounds for withdrawal. My lawyers will be in touch. He looked at Madeline. Ms. Rowe, if you survive tonight's vote, and I hope you do, I'd be interested in discussing a different kind of partnership. One built on the principles you just articulated rather than the ones your father taught you. He nodded to Ethan. And young man, I have a community foundation that funds music education in underserved areas. We could use someone with your experience and passion. If you're interested. Harold left the stage, followed by his executives, leaving chaos in their wake. Board members were arguing among themselves. Journalists were frantically updating their stories. And Richard stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed empire begin to fracture. You've destroyed us, he said to Madeline, his voice hollow. Everything I built, everything this family stood for. You've burned it all down. No, Madeline replied. I'm trying to rebuild it into something worth standing for. The vote, Jonathan demanded, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. The board needs to vote on Madeline's removal. Now. The vote was counted quickly, board members declaring their positions by voice. As Madeline had expected, the old guard, her father's allies, men who'd profited from decades of questionable practices, voted against her. But younger members, newer appointments, several of the independent directors, they voted to keep her. When the count was finished, it was 16-14 in Madeline's favor. The narrowest possible margin, but enough. Richard's expression transformed into something Madeline had never seen before. Not rage, not calculation, but defeat. Then I suppose there's nothing left to say, he said quietly. He looked at his daughter with eyes that held disappointment and something that might have been grudging respect. You've won, Madeline. Enjoy your victory. I hope it's worth the cost. He walked off the stage, his shoulders straight, but his movements those of a man who'd just lost everything that defined him. Jonathan followed after a moment's hesitation, pausing beside Madeline long enough to whisper, We're done. The engagement is off. You've chosen your side. I know, Madeline replied. Thank you for making it easy. As the conference hall emptied, board members and executives and journalists all filing out with their own agendas and interpretations, Madeline found herself alone on the stage with Ethan and Claire, who'd quietly made her way up to join them. Well, Claire said, that could have gone worse. How? Madeline asked, nearly laughing from exhaustion and adrenaline. The building could have caught fire? This time Madeline did laugh, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. She turned to Ethan. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make your life more complicated. If the publicity causes problems for you, Stop. Ethan interrupted gently. You don't need to apologize. What you did tonight, the courage it took to stand up to your father, to risk everything, that was extraordinary. It was terrifying, Madeline admitted. Courage usually is. They stood in the empty conference hall, the silence heavy with the weight of transformation. Everything had changed in the past hour. Madeline's relationship with her father, her engagement, her position at the company, all of it fundamentally altered. And yet, standing there, she felt lighter than she had in years. What happens now? She asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Now, Claire said practically, we deal with the fallout. The press is going to have a field day with this. Your father will probably contest the vote. Jonathan's family will likely pull their investment from several joint ventures. It's going to be messy. I meant more existentially, Madeline said. What do I do now that I've burned down my entire life? You rebuild it, Ethan suggested, into something better, something that actually reflects who you are instead of who you were told to be. And who am I? Madeline asked. I don't think I know anymore. Then you figure it out, Ethan replied. That's the gift of starting over. You get to choose. Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression shifting. Madeline, you need to see this. She held up her phone, showing a news alert. Sterling Industries CEO exposes corporate negligence in dramatic public confrontation. Stock price plummets. It's already hit the financial news sites, Claire continued, scrolling through alerts. Twitter is exploding. The hashtag Sterling Speaks, truth is trending, and oh no. What? Madeline asked. Your father just released a statement. He's claiming you had a mental breakdown, that you're suffering from extreme stress and are not competent to run the company. He's calling for a full board review of your decision-making capacity. Madeline felt cold wash through her. Of course her father would do this. He couldn't accept defeat, couldn't allow the narrative to be anything except one he controlled. If he couldn't remove her through a vote, he'd destroy her credibility instead. That's not going to work, Ethan said firmly. You weren't having a breakdown. You were telling the truth. There's a difference. Public perception doesn't always care about the difference, Claire pointed out. If he can paint you as unstable, if he can make people question your judgment, he can undermine everything you said tonight. Then I'll keep saying it, Madeline declared. I'll say it on every news program that will have me. I'll say it in board meetings and shareholder letters and anywhere else I can. Eventually, the truth will matter more than his spin. That's optimistic, Claire said doubtfully. It's all I have, Madeline replied. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Her mother's sister, Aunt Diana, one of the few family members who'd maintained emotional warmth despite the Rowe family's general coldness. I just saw the news, Diana said when Madeline answered. Are you all right? I don't know, Madeline admitted. I think so. I just destroyed my career, ended my engagement, and declared war on my father in front of 200 witnesses, but somehow I feel better than I have in years. That's because you finally did what your mother always wanted to do but never could, Diana said. You chose principle over power. She would be so proud of you, darling. The words broke something in Madeline, releasing tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. I miss her, she whispered. I know, we all do. But Maddie, listen to me. What you did tonight, that took the kind of strength your father has never understood. Not the strength to dominate or control, but the strength to be vulnerable, to risk everything for what's right. That's real power. Don't let him convince you otherwise. After hanging up, Madeline wiped her eyes, aware that both Ethan and Claire were politely pretending not to notice her tears. Sorry, she said. It's been a long day. You're allowed to cry, Ethan said gently. You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling. You don't have to be the invincible CEO right now. I don't know how to be anything else, Madeline admitted. Then learn, Ethan suggested. You're good at learning. You built an entire career on learning to be something your father wanted. Now learn to be what you want instead. And what if I don't know what I want? Then start with what you don't want, Ethan replied. You don't want to be the kind of leader your father was. You don't want to run a company that destroys people. You don't want to marry someone you don't love. Those are starting points. Build from there. Claire's phone buzzed again. The security team is getting nervous, she reported. Apparently there are reporters gathering outside. They want a statement from you. Madeline took a deep breath. Then let's give them one. They descended from the stage together, moving through the empty conference hall toward the main entrance. Through the glass doors, Madeline could see the cluster of journalists and cameras, vultures waiting to pick apart the evening's drama. You don't have to do this now, Claire said. We can issue a written statement, control the message. No, Madeline replied. I'm done controlling messages. I'm done with PR spin and carefully managed narratives. I'm going to stand out there and tell them exactly what happened and why I did it. And if they think I'm crazy or unstable or incompetent, then at least they'll know the truth. She pushed through the doors into the cold night air, immediately assaulted by shouted questions and camera flashes. Ms. Rowe, is it true you had a breakdown? Ms. Rowe, have you been removed as CEO? Ms. Rowe, what's your relationship with the maintenance worker? Madeline held up her hands, waiting for the cacophony to die down. When it finally quieted enough for her to be heard, she spoke clearly and directly. My name is Madeline Rowe. I am still the CEO of Sterling Industries, having survived a board vote of confidence tonight. I did not have a breakdown. I made a choice to prioritize truth over corporate image, to acknowledge harm our company has caused, and to commit to doing better going forward. If that makes me unfit to lead, then perhaps we need to re-examine what fitness for leadership actually means. What about your father's accusations? A journalist called out. My father built an empire through practices I no longer wish to perpetuate, Madeline replied. We disagree on fundamental principles. That doesn't make either of us crazy. It just makes us different. What about the maintenance worker, the pianist? Madeline glanced back at where Ethan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Ethan Coltrane is a man whose career was destroyed by corporate negligence. Sterling Industries failed him, and I'm committed to making that right. Beyond that, his story is his to tell, not mine. Are you dating him? Another journalist asked. That's none of your business, Madeline said firmly. Next question. The questions continued, each one probing, challenging, trying to find weakness or scandal. But Madeline answered them all with the same unwavering honesty that had defined her speech tonight. Yes, she might lose her position. Yes, the company might suffer financially. Yes, she was risking everything, but for the first time in her adult life, she was doing it on her own terms. When the impromptu press conference finally ended and the journalists dispersed to file their stories, Madeline returned to the building's lobby where Ethan and Claire waited. That was either very brave or very foolish, Claire observed. Probably both, Madeline agreed. She turned to Ethan. Thank you for coming tonight, for being willing to speak. I know it wasn't easy. Neither was what you did, Ethan replied. But I think maybe Marcus would be proud of both of us for finishing what he started in our own way. The song? Madeline asked. The song, Ethan confirmed, but also the belief that love and truth matter more than power and profit. That was always his philosophy. It's why he left Juilliard. It's why he was so happy with you. You made him believe that art and life could coexist, that he didn't have to sacrifice one for the other. I failed him, Madeline said softly. After he died, I became everything he wouldn't have wanted. I chose power because it felt safer than vulnerability. You were 19 and grieving, Ethan said, echoing Claire's earlier words. You survived the only way you knew how, but now you're choosing differently. That's what matters. They stood in the quiet lobby, three people bound by tragedy and music and the fragile hope that maybe, despite everything, second chances were possible. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Inside, the building that had witnessed so much pain and profit stood silent, waiting to see what would emerge from the wreckage of this extraordinary night. I should go, Ethan said finally. Sophie's with my neighbor, and it's getting late. Ethan? Madeline called as he turned to leave. The offer still stands. The new position, the compensation review, all of it. Whatever my father does, whatever happens with the board, I'll make sure you're taken care of. I know you will, Ethan said. But I'm not doing this for compensation, Madeline. I'm doing it because for 7 years I've been invisible, and tonight you saw me. You saw all of us. Every person Sterling Industries has hurt, every story that's been buried. That matters more than money. He left, the door closing softly behind him. Claire and Madeline stood in the empty lobby, the weight of the evening settling over them like snow. "You know, tomorrow's going to be hell, right?" Claire said. "Your father will fight. Jonathan will spread rumors. The board will question every decision you make. It's going to be brutal." "I know," Madeline replied. "And you're still going through with this? Trying to reform a company that doesn't want to be reformed? Fighting battles you'll probably lose?" "I am." "Why?" Madeline thought about the question, about all the answers she could give: duty, principle, stubbornness, guilt. But finally, she settled on the truest one. "Because," she said, 16 years ago, I loved someone who believed people mattered more than success. And I spent the next decade and a half proving him wrong by becoming someone who valued success above all else. And tonight, I heard his song again, finished by someone who'd also lost everything but chose to keep creating beauty anyway. And I realized that maybe it's not too late. Maybe I can still become the person Marcus believed I could be." "That's a lot of pressure to put on a memory," Claire observed. "Then I'll put it on reality instead," Madeline replied. "I'll become that person not for Marcus, but for me. For every Ethan Coltrane out there who deserves better than being crushed by companies that see people as expendable. For Sophie, who deserves to grow up in a world where her father's talent is recognized instead of buried. For every person I can help instead of hurt." Claire smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful professional expression she usually wore. "Okay then," she said, "let's change the world. Or at least try, even if it kills us." "Especially if it kills us," Madeline agreed. "That's how you know it mattered." They left the building together, stepping out into a night that felt electric with possibility and danger. Somewhere in the city, Richard Rowe was planning his counterattack. Jonathan was crafting narratives to destroy her reputation. Board members were calculating which side would ultimately prevail. But for this moment, walking through Manhattan streets dusted with snow, Madeline felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt free. The freedom lasted approximately 12 hours. By morning, the full force of her father's counteroffensive had mobilized with military precision. Madeline woke to 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and a cascade of emails that began with professional concern and escalated rapidly into barely veiled threats. The financial news networks were running endless loops of her confrontation with Richard, dissecting every word, every gesture, bringing in corporate psychologists to analyze her mental state and legal experts to debate whether her revelations constituted fiduciary negligence. Sterling Industries' stock had dropped 14% in after-hours trading. 3 major investors had pulled out completely. The company's law firm had issued a statement distancing themselves from Madeline's unauthorized disclosures while simultaneously defending Sterling's historical practices as industry-standard risk management. And Richard had scheduled an emergency shareholders meeting for the end of the week, clearly intending to use it as a platform to remove her permanently. Madeline sat at her kitchen table in sweatpants and an old Columbia t-shirt she'd found buried in her closet, watching the news coverage with a strange sense of detachment. Was that really her on the screen? That woman with her hair down and passion in her voice, burning down an empire because a song reminded her of who she used to be? It seemed almost absurd in the harsh light of mourning consequences. Her phone buzzed. Claire, calling for the 5th time. "I'm alive," Madeline said by way of greeting. "Stop panicking." "I'll stop panicking when you stop ignoring reality," Claire replied. "Have you seen the Wall Street Journal? The headline is Sterling CEO's Emotional Breakdown Reveals Company Liability Issues. Your father gave them an exclusive interview where he said you've been under tremendous stress since your mother's death and may need professional help." "Of course he did," Madeline said, too tired to feel angry. "That's his move. Discredit the messenger so people ignore the message." "It's working," Claire said bluntly. "The narrative is shifting from company did wrong to unstable woman has meltdown. We need to control this, Madeline. We need a strategy." "The strategy is telling the truth," Madeline replied. "Same as last night." "Truth doesn't always win," Claire said, her voice gentle but firm. "You know that. You need allies. You need PR support. You need—" "What I need," Madeline interrupted, "is to not become the thing I'm fighting against. The moment I start spinning narratives and managing optics instead of just being honest, I've lost, even if I win." Claire was silent for a moment, then, "You're either the bravest person I know or the most stubborn. I haven't decided which. Can't I be both?" "That's what I'm afraid of." After hanging up, Madeline forced herself to shower and dress, to put on armor in the form of a charcoal suit and the pearls her mother had loved. If she was going down, she'd go down looking like someone who'd made conscious choices rather than someone who'd fallen apart. The elevator ride to Sterling Industries' executive floor felt longer than usual, each floor a countdown to whatever disaster awaited. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a reception area full of hostile faces, executives who'd built careers on her father's patronage, assistants who'd witnessed her public confrontation with the man who signed their paychecks, colleagues who'd chosen sides and hadn't chosen hers. Patricia Chen, the engineering supervisor who'd provided the damning safety reports, stood near the coffee station looking bruised and defiant. When she saw Madeline, she straightened her shoulders. "They've been calling me a liar all morning," Patricia said without preamble. "Your father's people are saying I fabricated those reports out of spite, that I'm a disgruntled employee trying to hurt the company." "Are you disgruntled?" Madeline asked. "Hell yes, I'm disgruntled," Patricia replied. "I've watched this company cut corners and endanger people for 30 years. I've filed reports that got buried, raised concerns that got dismissed, tried to do the right thing within a system designed to reward the wrong thing. So yes, I'm disgruntled, but I'm not a liar." "I know," Madeline said, "and I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." "At what cost?" Patricia asked, her voice softening. "Ms. Rowe, I appreciate what you did last night, but I'm 61 years old with a pension I can't afford to lose. You're young enough to start over. I'm not. If they fire me, if they destroy my reputation, I have nowhere to go." The weight of responsibility settled on Madeline's shoulders like a physical thing. She'd started this fight thinking about abstract principles, truth, justice, redemption. But Patricia's fear was concrete, immediate, a reminder that moral stands had practical consequences for real people with mortgages and medical insurance and futures that depended on systems they couldn't afford to overthrow. "I won't let them destroy you," Madeline promised. "Whatever happens to me, I'll make sure you're protected." "You can't promise that," Patricia said. "You might not have the power to protect anyone, including yourself." Before Madeline could respond, her office door opened and Jonathan stepped out, looking like he'd dressed for battle in a Navy suit that probably cost more than Patricia made in a month. His expression was cold, calculated, none of the charm he usually deployed like a weapon. "Madeline," he said, her name clipped and formal, "we need to talk. Privately." She followed him into her office, noting that he'd positioned himself behind her desk, a power move so obvious it would have been laughable if it weren't so revealing. This was how men like Jonathan operated, she realized. They took up space that wasn't theirs, claimed authority they hadn't earned, and expected everyone to accept their dominance as natural order. "I'm here as a courtesy," Jonathan began without preamble. "Your father wanted to have you escorted out by security, but I convinced him to let me try reasoning with you first." "How generous," Madeline said dryly. "Don't be flippant. This is serious." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into what he probably thought was persuasive sincerity. "You made your point last night, you got everyone's attention. Now it's time to walk it back before you do permanent damage." "Walk it back?" Madeline repeated. "Jonathan, I exposed systematic corporate negligence. I revealed that Sterling Industries has been covering up accidents and silencing victims for years. What exactly am I supposed to walk back?" "The emotional aspect," Jonathan replied smoothly. "Announce that you were under tremendous stress, that recent personal losses affected your judgment, that you spoke hastily without full information. Your father is willing to publicly support you getting professional help while you take a temporary leave of absence. In other words, admit I had a breakdown and quietly disappear while he reasserts control. In other words, save your career and your reputation while we handle the legal and PR cleanup," Jonathan corrected. "This can still be managed, Madeline, but you have to stop fighting." "And if I don't?" Jonathan's expression hardened. "Then the full board meeting on Friday becomes a referendum on your fitness to lead. And I can promise you, when your father finishes presenting his case, complete with expert testimony about your mental state, character witnesses discussing your erratic behavior, and evidence of the financial damage your accusations have caused, You'll be removed. Not by a narrow margin, unanimously. You seem confident about that, Madeline observed. I am confident, Jonathan said, because I know how these people think. They care about their investments, their returns, their own positions. They don't care about your moral crusade or your guilt about some pianist who got hurt years ago. They care about stability and profit. Your father offers both. You offer chaos. He stood, straightening his cuffs with practiced precision. I actually came here hoping to save you from yourself. We were engaged, Madeline. Despite everything, I don't want to see you destroyed. But if you insist on this path, I won't be able to protect you. I never asked you to protect me, Madeline replied. And Jonathan, we were never really engaged. We were in a business arrangement that we both pretended was a relationship. I'm honestly relieved it's over. Something flickered in Jonathan's eyes, hurt, perhaps, or wounded pride. You'll regret this, he said quietly. When you're unemployable and alone and watching from the outside while Sterling Industries continues exactly as it always has, you'll realize you threw everything away for nothing. Or, Madeline suggested, I'll realize I finally started living according to my own values instead of someone else's expectations. Either way, it'll be my choice. After Jonathan left, Madeline stood at her office window looking down at the city below. From this height, people were anonymous, interchangeable, their individual struggles invisible. How easy it was to make decisions that affected thousands of lives when those lives were reduced to numbers on spreadsheets, statistics, and quarterly reports, abstractions that never looked you in the eye and asked why their suffering mattered less than profit margins. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Rowe? This is Ethan. I hope it's okay that Claire gave me your personal number. I wanted to check if you're all right. The news coverage is pretty brutal. Madeline found herself smiling despite everything. She typed back, I've been better, but I'm still standing. How's Sophie? Confused about why Daddy was on TV, I told her we were helping someone tell an important story. She wants to know if you're a superhero now. Tell her I'm just someone trying to do the right thing, not very heroic. She says trying to do the right thing when it's hard is being a superhero. 7-year-old wisdom. Madeline's smile widened. She sounds wise beyond her years. She gets that from her mother. Jennifer was the strongest person I knew. She faced her cancer diagnosis while pregnant and chose Sophie's life over aggressive treatment that might have saved her own. That's the kind of courage I'm trying to teach Sophie to recognize. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet choice to value someone else's well-being above your own comfort. The text sat on Madeline's screen, a reminder of stakes she'd never had to consider. Ethan had lost so much, his career, his wife, years of struggle raising a daughter alone. And yet he'd shown up last night, vulnerable and honest, risking whatever stability he'd managed to build because truth mattered more than safety. What was she risking, really? Money she didn't need? A position she'd never truly wanted? A father's approval she'd been chasing her entire life but had never actually received? Seen from that perspective, her courage seemed far less impressive. Her office door opened without warning. Her father walked in, flanked by 2 members of Sterling's legal team, carrying himself with the absolute authority of someone who'd never been meaningfully challenged in his professional life. Madeline, he said, claiming the chair across from her desk rather than trying to dominate from behind it. A tactical shift, she noted, from overt power display to paternal concern. I think it's time we had a real conversation, without audiences or cameras or people trying to score points. All right, Madeline said carefully. Let's talk. Richard dismissed the lawyers with a gesture. When they were alone, his expression shifted, became something almost human. I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen. You made your position clear. But I want you to understand mine. I'm listening. Everything I've built, Richard began, his voice heavy with conviction, every decision I've made has been to secure this family's future. Your mother understood that, even when it hurt her. She knew that building something lasting required sacrifices. Mom died at 52, Madeline said quietly. What kind of future did she get to enjoy? Richard flinched, the first genuine emotional response she'd seen from him in years. Your mother had a heart condition. It wasn't just genetics, Madeline interrupted. It was stress and loneliness and living with a man who valued his company more than his wife. I watched her fade, Dad. I watched her try to get your attention, to matter to you as much as quarterly earnings mattered. And I watched her give up. That's not fair, isn't it? Madeline leaned forward. Tell me honestly, if Mom had asked you to choose between her and Sterling Industries, which would you have picked? The silence stretched long enough to be an answer. That's what I thought, Madeline said. And it's why I can't be you, Dad. Because I saw where that path leads, and it leads to dying alone in a house full of expensive things, but empty of love. I won't do that. I won't become someone who's so armored against vulnerability that I can't recognize my own humanity anymore. Vulnerability is weakness, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. In this world, the vulnerable get crushed. Or they get freed, Madeline countered. Free to build something real instead of just something powerful. Free to connect with people instead of control them. Free to fail spectacularly while trying to do the right thing instead of succeeding miserably at doing the wrong thing. Richard stood, moving to the window where Madeline had stood moments before. I'm going to remove you on Friday, he said, his back to her. The board will vote, and you'll lose. I'll make sure of it. I know. And you're still not going to back down? You're still going to fight me? I'm not fighting you, Dad, Madeline said gently. I'm fighting a system that you built and I perpetuated. But you're not the system. You're a person who made choices based on what you thought mattered. I'm just choosing differently. Your mother said something similar once, Richard admitted quietly. Right before... He stopped, shook his head. She asked me if winning was worth losing ourselves. I told her it was a false choice, that we could have both. But maybe she was right. Maybe I did lose myself, somewhere along the way. For a moment, Madeline glimpsed the man her father might have been before ambition calcified into identity. A man capable of doubt, of reflection, of recognizing that victory could taste like defeat if it required destroying everything tender in himself. But then the moment passed. Richard's shoulders straightened, his expression hardened back into the mask of authority he'd worn for so long it had become his face. Friday, he said simply. Make your peace with it. He left, and Madeline was alone with her thoughts and the city sprawling below and the growing certainty that she was about to lose everything she'd spent a decade building. The strange thing was how little that certainty frightened her. Losing felt almost like relief, like setting down a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight. The rest of the day passed in a blur of hostile meetings and carefully worded legal threats. Executives who'd once courted her favor now avoided eye contact. Assistants whispered in corners. The machinery of corporate warfare ground forward with inevitable momentum, and Madeline was on the wrong side of it. By evening, she was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She left the building through a side entrance to avoid reporters, drove herself home rather than using her company car, and entered her penthouse feeling like a stranger in her own life. Her phone buzzed. Ethan again. Random question. Sophie wants to make you a thank you card for letting her see the Christmas tree. Is it okay if she knows where to send it? Or would that be weird? Madeline typed back. That's very sweet, but maybe I could come see her instead, if that's not too intrusive. Sophie would love that. So would I. Tomorrow afternoon? We could have dinner. Nothing fancy. I'm making spaghetti. Spaghetti sounds perfect. She spent the next day preparing for the shareholders' meeting, reviewing Patricia's evidence, crafting arguments she knew wouldn't matter because the outcome had already been decided. Claire worked beside her in grim silence, occasionally offering suggestions, but mostly just bearing witness to what they both knew was a losing battle. You could still walk away, Claire said as afternoon shadows lengthened across the office. Announce your resignation, negotiate a severance, leave with some dignity intact. Would that be dignified? Madeline asked. Quitting before they can fire me? It might be strategic. I'm done being strategic, Madeline replied. I'm going to show up Friday and let them vote. And whatever they decide, at least I'll know I fought for something that mattered. Even if it destroys you? Especially then, because that's how you know you believed in something. You were willing to be destroyed for it. That evening, Madeline drove to Queens carrying a bottle of wine that probably cost more than she should have spent and wearing jeans that felt strange after years of professional armor. Ethan opened the door in an apron covered with cartoon dinosaurs, flour dusting his hair, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "Fair warning," he said as she entered. "Sophie has been preparing your thank you card for hours. It's very elaborate. She used all her favorite markers." Sophie appeared from around the corner, holding a piece of construction paper covered in drawings of Christmas trees, stars, and what appeared to be a princess with dark hair who Madeline realized with a jolt was meant to be her. "I made you," Sophie announced proudly. "You're the pretty lady who lets people see beautiful things even when other people say they're not allowed. Daddy says that's very important." Madeline knelt down to Sophie's level, studying the drawing with genuine appreciation. "This is beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you." "Do you really live in a tower?" Sophie asked. "Daddy says you have an apartment way up high where you can see the whole city, like Rapunzel, but without the long hair." "I do live up high," Madeline confirmed, "but it's not as magical as it sounds. It's actually kind of lonely sometimes." "You should get a cat," Sophie suggested with the simple wisdom of children. "Cats make everything less lonely." "That's good advice." They ate dinner at the small table, Sophie chattering about school and her best friend Maya, who had a dog named Biscuit, and her teacher Ms. Anderson, who let them have extra recess when it snowed. Ethan listened with patient attention, occasionally catching Madeline's eye with expressions that said, "Sorry about the nonstop talking, but also, isn't she wonderful?" She was wonderful. They both were. Sitting in this small apartment eating spaghetti from mismatched plates, Madeline felt more present, more authentically herself, than she had in any five-star restaurant or corporate dinner. There was no performance here, no calculation, just the simple humanity of sharing a meal with people who saw her as a person rather than a position. After Sophie went to bed, Ethan made tea and they sat in the living room, the electric keyboard humming quietly in the corner. "Friday is the shareholders' meeting," Madeline said. "My father is going to have me removed as CEO. It's going to be ugly." "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "Don't be. I knew the cost when I made the choice." She paused, then asked, "Do you ever regret it? Speaking out at the announcement? You could have stayed invisible, kept your job, avoided all the attention." "Every time I look at Sophie, I remember why I did it," Ethan replied. "She's growing up in a world where power usually wins and truth usually loses. I wanted her to see, at least once, that sometimes people fight back, that sometimes doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing. Even if fighting back doesn't change anything?" "It changed me," Ethan said simply. "For 7 years, I was invisible, erased, reduced to someone who emptied trash cans in a building where I once performed. I'd accepted that as my identity, the broken pianist, the victim, the man whose life ended at 27. But when you walked into my apartment demanding truth, when you looked at me like I was still a person who mattered, something shifted. I remembered that I get to choose who I am, that my worth isn't defined by what was taken from me." He stood, moved to the keyboard, his damaged hand resting gently on the keys. "Want to hear what I've been working on?" "Always." He began to play, and the melody that emerged was Marcus's song, but transformed again. This version had new passages, developments that built on the original theme while taking it in unexpected directions. It was about loss, yes, but also about resilience, about being broken and choosing to create beauty from the broken pieces. When he finished, Madeline found tears on her cheeks. "That's extraordinary," she whispered. "It's a work in progress," Ethan said. "I'm calling it completion, because it's about finishing things we thought were impossible, about honoring the past while building something new." "Will you play it at the shareholders' meeting?" Madeline asked suddenly. "On Friday, before they vote, will you play it?" Ethan looked uncertain. "That seems dramatic." "Everything about this week has been dramatic," Madeline replied, "and I want them to hear it. I want them to understand what they're voting for, not just corporate policy, but actual human consequences. Your music makes that real in a way my words can't." "All right," Ethan agreed. "I'll play. But Madeline, even if they vote you out, even if nothing changes at Sterling Industries, you changed something in me, in Sophie, and probably a lot of people watching this unfold. That's not nothing." "It doesn't feel like enough." "Maybe enough isn't the right measure," Ethan suggested. "Maybe what matters is whether you showed up and tried, whether you chose courage over comfort when it mattered. Madeline left his apartment late that night, driving through empty streets back to her tower in Manhattan. The contrast between the two worlds, Ethan's small, warm apartment and her vast, empty penthouse, felt almost violent. She stood at her window looking down at the city. All those anonymous lights representing lives she'd never know, struggles she'd never understand. Her phone buzzed one last time. A text from her Aunt Diana. "Whatever happens Friday, remember you've already won the only battle that really matters, the one for your own soul. Your mother would be so proud. I know I am." Madeline saved the message, holding on to it like a lifeline against the uncertainty of what was coming. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She cried, really cried, grieving for her mother and for Marcus and for the person she'd been before she'd armored herself against feeling anything at all. And in the morning, when she woke with swollen eyes and a clear conscience, she began preparing for the most important performance of her life. Not a performance of power or control, but of truth, of showing up vulnerable and honest and utterly herself, whatever the cost. Friday arrived with the inevitability of storms, bringing with it television crews and protesters and a media circus that had transformed Sterling Industries' shareholders meeting into a public referendum on corporate ethics. Madeline arrived early, dressed simply in the blue dress her mother had loved, her hair down, her armor abandoned in favor of authenticity. Claire met her in the lobby, looking exhausted but determined. "Ethan's already here. He's setting up in the auditorium. Sophie came with him. He couldn't find a sitter on short notice, so she's backstage coloring." "Good," Madeline said. "She should see this. Whatever happens, she should see that her father is remarkable." "So are you," Claire said quietly. "For what it's worth, I'm honored to have worked with you. Win or lose, you've been the best boss I've ever had." "Even though I'm about to destroy my career over a song and a maintenance worker?" "Especially because of that," Claire replied. Because it means you value the right things." The auditorium filled quickly, shareholders taking their seats with the eager anticipation of people who'd come to witness either a rebellion or an execution. Richard sat in the front row with his allies, his expression carved from granite. Jonathan sat beside him, already rehearsing his victory smile. The board members took their positions, preparing to judge and vote and determine the future of a company that had forgotten the humanity at its foundation. Madeline walked onto the stage, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Before we begin the formal proceedings," she said, "I'd like to introduce someone. Many of you know him as a maintenance worker. But before Sterling Industries destroyed his career, Ethan Coltrane was one of the most gifted pianists of his generation. He's going to play something for you. And I'm asking you to listen, not just with your ears, but with whatever part of you still remembers that numbers on spreadsheets represent actual human lives." Ethan walked onto the stage, and Madeline saw several shareholders recognize him from the news coverage, saw the whispers start, saw her father's expression darken with barely controlled rage. But Ethan moved to the grand piano with quiet dignity, positioned his damaged hand carefully on the keys, and began to play. The music that filled the auditorium was heartbreaking and hopeful in equal measure, each note carrying the weight of loss and the defiant beauty of survival. It was Marcus's song, completed by Ethan's pain and determination, transformed into something that spoke to everyone who'd ever been broken and chosen to keep going anyway. When the last note faded into silence, the auditorium sat stunned. Even Richard looked shaken, his armor momentarily pierced by art that refused to be reduced to corporate calculation. Madeline returned to the microphone. "That song was written by Marcus Chen, my first love, who died at 19. It was finished by Ethan Coltrane, who lost everything because this company prioritized profit over safety. And it's being played today as a reminder that behind every business decision, there are human consequences. We get to choose what we value more, the bottom line or the people who create it." She took a breath, then continued. "I know most of you will vote to remove me today. I know my father has the influence and the arguments and the fear on his side. But I want you to vote knowing what you're choosing. Not between business philosophies, but between the company we've been and the company we could become." Richard stood, his voice carrying the weight of decades of command. "Madeline, you've said your piece. Now let's vote and move forward." The vote was called. Hands raised across the auditorium, some quickly, some with visible reluctance. Claire counted silently from her position in the wings, her expression growing more grim with each uplifted palm. When the final count was announced, Madeline had lost 38 to 12. It wasn't even close. Richard's expression was carefully neutral, but Madeline saw triumph flash in his eyes. "Motion passes," he said formally. "Madeline Rowe is removed as CEO effective immediately. I will resume executive leadership while the board conducts a search for a permanent replacement." Madeline nodded, accepting the verdict with grace she'd learned from her mother. "Thank you for the opportunity to serve," she said simply. "I hope whoever leads next remembers that Sterling Industries' greatest asset isn't its buildings or its patents or its profit margins. It's the people who believe in it enough to give their time, their talent, and their trust. Don't waste that." She walked off the stage to scattered applause, some supportive, some mocking, most just relieved the drama was finally over. Ethan met her in the wings, Sophie clutching his hand, her eyes wide with confusion about what had just happened. "Did you lose?" Sophie asked with devastating directness. "I did," Madeline confirmed, kneeling down to the girl's level. "But you were so brave," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "You told the truth. That's what superheroes do." "Sometimes superheroes lose, sweetheart," Madeline said gently. "But that doesn't mean they were wrong to try." "So you're still a hero?" Sophie persisted, "even though you lost?" Madeline looked at Ethan, saw the pride in his eyes, felt the weight of the past week settling into something she could finally carry. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm just a person who tried to do better. That's all any of us can be." Sophie considered this, then threw her arms around Madeline's neck in an impulsive hug that nearly knocked her over. "I think you're the best kind of person," she declared, "the kind who makes things beautiful even when they're broken." Madeline held this child she barely knew, feeling something unlock in her chest, grief and relief, and the tentative beginning of hope all tangled together. When she finally pulled back, she saw tears on Ethan's face too. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything, for seeing me, for fighting, for showing Sophie what courage looks like." "Thank you," Madeline replied, "for reminding me who I used to be, who I could be again." They left Sterling Industries together, walking out through a gauntlet of reporters and cameras into the uncertain afternoon. Madeline had no job, no clear future, no idea what came next. But walking between Ethan and Sophie, she felt lighter than she had in years. Free in a way that power had never allowed, vulnerable in a way that finally felt like strength. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked as they reached the street. "I don't know," Madeline admitted. "Figure out who I am when I'm not being my father's daughter, or Sterling Industries' CEO. Maybe get a cat like Sophie suggested." "Or," Ethan ventured carefully, "maybe help me with something Harold Blackwood mentioned. His foundation needs someone to manage the education initiatives, to turn resources into actual programs that help kids access music instruction. It doesn't pay what you're used to, but I'm in," Madeline interrupted. "Whatever it pays, wherever it is, I'm in." "Just like that?" "Just like that," she confirmed, "because I'm done calculating every move. I'm done choosing safety over meaning. I'm ready to build something that matters, even if, especially if, it's built from broken pieces." Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. Does this mean she can come to dinner again? Please?" Ethan laughed, the sound bright and free. "Yes, Princess. She can come to dinner, whenever she wants." They walked through Manhattan together as evening fell, three people bound by music and loss and the stubborn belief that sometimes, against all odds and evidence, choosing love over power was worth the cost. Behind them, Sterling Industries continued its relentless operations, unchanged by one woman's rebellion. But ahead of them, lit by street lamps and possibility, lay something more precious than empire. The chance to build a life that reflected not what they'd lost, but what they'd learned from losing. The chance to create beauty from brokenness, to find completeness in fragments, to discover that sometimes the greatest victory is the courage to admit you're human and let that humanity guide you home. The year that followed unfolded with the quiet intensity of seeds breaking through winter soil. Madeline discovered that rebuilding a life was harder than destroying one, that creating something from nothing required more courage than tearing down structures already standing. But it was also, unexpectedly, filled with moments of grace she'd never allowed herself to experience when her days were measured in quarterly earnings and shareholder approval. Harold Blackwood's foundation occupied a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, its exposed brick walls covered with children's artwork, and its practice rooms filled with donated instruments in various states of repair. Madeline's title was Director of Program Development, which sounded impressive until she arrived the first day and discovered it meant she'd be doing everything from grant writing to mopping floors when the custodian called in sick. "Welcome to nonprofit work," Harold said with a wry smile when he found her wrestling with a particularly stubborn funding proposal 3 weeks into the job, where good intentions meet impossible budgets, and everyone works twice as hard for a quarter of the pay. "I like it," Madeline replied, and realized she meant it. The work was exhausting and often frustrating, but it connected directly to results she could see: children learning to read music, teenagers finding confidence through performance, families accessing arts education they couldn't otherwise afford. Every dollar mattered because every dollar represented an opportunity that might otherwise not exist. Ethan had started teaching piano 2 days a week, working with students who reminded Madeline of Sophie, bright, curious, hungry for beauty in lives that didn't always provide it. She'd watch him through the practice room windows sometimes, seeing how gentle he was with the children who struggled, how patient with the ones who had talent but lacked discipline, how he'd adapted his teaching method to accommodate his damaged hand by focusing on musical understanding rather than technical perfection. "You're staring again," Claire said one afternoon, appearing beside Madeline with coffee and the slightly amused expression she wore whenever she caught her former boss gazing at the piano teacher. "I'm observing," Madeline corrected primly. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Claire had left Sterling Industries a month after Madeline's removal, unable to stomach working for Richard after everything that had happened. She joined the foundation as administrative director, taking a massive pay cut and claiming she didn't miss corporate life at all. Madeline suspected that was mostly true. "How's the grant application coming?" Claire asked, nodding toward Madeline's laptop. "Slowly. They want evidence of community impact, but we've only been operational for 8 months. I'm trying to explain that transformation takes time, that you can't measure a child's growing confidence in spreadsheets. Welcome to the eternal struggle of proving that things that matter can't always be quantified," Claire said. "Also, Ethan asked me to tell you that Sophie's recital is next week. He wants to make sure you're coming." "Of course I'm coming," Madeline said. "I've been helping Sophie practice. Did you know she's learning that Chopin nocturne, the same one her dad used to perform? The one he can't play anymore because of his hand." "The one he's teaching her to play better than he ever did," Madeline corrected softly. "He says that's the gift of teaching. You get to help someone else achieve what you couldn't." Claire studied her friend's face, seeing something there that made her smile. "You love him," she said simply. Madeline's first instinct was to deny it, to deflect, to protect herself with the emotional armor she'd worn for so long. But she'd spent the past year learning to be honest, especially with herself. "I'm starting to," she admitted quietly, "which terrifies me. The last person I loved died, and I spent 16 years convinced that loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. Or," Claire suggested gently, "it means giving them the power to make you more fully alive than you could ever be alone. But I get why that's scary." The recital was held in the Foundation's main performance space, a modest auditorium that held maybe 200 people but felt full when packed with families who'd come to celebrate their children's hard work. Madeline sat in the third row, watching parents film everything on their phones, siblings squirm in their seats, grandparents beam with pride at accomplishments that would never win competitions or launch careers but mattered immensely anyway. Sophie played midway through the program, walking onto the stage in a blue dress that Madeline had helped her pick out, her dark curls pulled back with clips that kept slipping loose. She looked terrified and determined in equal measure, exactly how Madeline had felt walking onto the stage for her final shareholders meeting. Ethan stood in the wings where Sophie could see him, his expression radiating encouragement and love, and the particular pride of a parent watching their child step into bravery. When Sophie's fingers touched the keys and the first notes of the Chopin Nocturne filled the space, Madeline felt tears prick her eyes. The performance wasn't perfect. Sophie stumbled over a few passages, lost her place once and had to restart a measure, played some sections too fast because nervousness made her rush. But she finished, and when she did, she looked toward her father with an expression of such pure joy that Madeline understood something profound. Perfection was overrated. What mattered was showing up, trying, being willing to fail publicly in pursuit of something beautiful. The applause was thunderous, disproportionate to the technical merit of the performance, but perfectly calibrated to honor a child's courage. Sophie took her bow with theatrical flair, then ran off the stage straight into her father's arms. After the recital, families gathered in the lobby for cookies and punch that tasted like childhood and community. Madeline watched Sophie accept compliments from other students and parents, watched how Ethan beamed when people praised his daughter's performance, watched the way this small moment of artistic achievement bound people together in shared appreciation for beauty created by imperfect human hands. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, finding Madeline near the refreshment table. It meant a lot to Sophie, to both of us. "I wouldn't have missed it," Madeline replied. She was wonderful, brave and honest and completely herself. "She gets that from her mother," Ethan said, his voice catching slightly on the reference to Jennifer. Jennifer always said that authenticity was more valuable than perfection, that the world had enough polished performances and not enough real ones. "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," Ethan agreed. "And I think she'd like you." She always believed in second chances, in people finding their way back to who they were meant to be. She'd say you're doing exactly that. "I'm trying," Madeline said. "Some days are harder than others. I still wake up sometimes and reach for my phone to check stock prices before remembering that's not my life anymore." "Do you miss it?" Ethan asked. "The power, the influence, all of it?" Madeline considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the certainty. When you're CEO, you always know your role, your purpose, your place in the hierarchy. Now everything feels more ambiguous, but I don't miss the person I was becoming, the one who could walk past suffering and calculate acceptable losses. That person was surviving but not living." "And now?" "Now I'm living," Madeline said simply. "It's messier and scarier and involves a lot more floor mopping than I expected. But it's real." Sophie appeared between them, her face flushed with excitement and cookie crumbs. "Daddy, can Madeline come to dinner, please? I want to show her the new song you're teaching me." "If Madeline's not too tired," Ethan said, looking at her with a question in his eyes that went beyond dinner plans. "I'm not too tired," Madeline replied, understanding what he was really asking. "I'd love to come." They took the subway to Queens, Sophie chattering the entire way about her performance and her friends, and a boy in her class named Timothy who pulled her hair but she thought maybe liked her. The ordinariness of it struck Madeline. 6 months ago, she'd have been in the back of a town car, insulated from the press of humanity around her. Now she stood squeezed between Ethan and a woman with 3 shopping bags, and it felt more real than any luxury she'd previously known. Dinner was pasta again, because, as Ethan explained, it was Sophie's favorite and his most reliable dish. They ate by candlelight because one of the kitchen bulbs had blown, and Ethan hadn't had time to replace it, and somehow the imperfection made the meal more intimate, more honest than any 5-star restaurant Madeline had dined in. After Sophie went to bed, Madeline helped Ethan clean up, the two of them moving around the small kitchen with the comfortable choreography of people who'd shared space often enough to anticipate each other's movements. When the last dish was dried and put away, they stood at the sink, close enough that Madeline could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint scent of soap, and the particular clean smell of someone who'd spent the day around children and music. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said quietly, not quite looking at her. "Something I should have told you months ago." Madeline's heart clenched. "All right. The night Marcus died," Ethan began, his voice rough with old pain. "We'd had that fight I mentioned. About music, about competition, about stupid pride. He'd called me after, left a voicemail apologizing. But I was still angry, still stubborn, so I didn't call back. And then he stopped, his damaged hand gripping the edge of the sink. And then he died. And I never got to tell him I was sorry, that I loved him like a brother, that our friendship mattered more than any competition or ego. Ethan, Madeline said softly, you can't blame yourself for that. I don't, he replied. Not anymore. It took years of therapy and Sophie asking questions about her Uncle Marcus, because that's what I told her he was, the uncle who died before she was born, for me to forgive myself. But there's more. He turned to face her fully. When I met you at the Christmas party, when I played Marcus's song and saw your face, I knew immediately who you were. Marcus had shown me pictures, talked about you constantly. I knew you were his Maddie. Madeline felt something shift inside her chest. You knew? This whole time, you knew? From the first moment, Ethan confirmed. And I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid you'd think I'd manipulated the situation somehow, sought you out deliberately. Afraid you'd question every conversation we'd had, every connection we'd built. Why are you telling me now? Madeline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I'm falling in love with you, Ethan said simply. And I can't build something real on a foundation of omission. You deserve to know everything, to choose me, or not, with full information. The kitchen felt very small suddenly, the walls close, the air heavy with confession and possibility. Madeline could feel her heart hammering, could feel the instinct to retreat, to protect herself, to run before she could be hurt again. But she'd spent a year learning to choose courage over safety. Did you seek me out? She asked. Deliberately? No, Ethan replied firmly. I was already working at Sterling Industries when you became CEO. If anything, I tried to avoid you because seeing you reminded me of Marcus, of everything I'd lost. But then you stopped at that Christmas party and saw me, really saw me, and everything changed. And the song? Playing it where I'd hear it? That was coincidence, Ethan said. Or fate, if you believe in that. I played it for Sophie because it was her lullaby. I had no idea you'd be close enough to hear or that you'd recognize it after all these years. Madeline studied his face, reading truth in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the vulnerability it took to admit all of this, knowing she might walk away. I believe you, she said finally. Relief washed over Ethan's features. You do? I do. Because you've never lied to me about anything else. Because omission isn't the same as deception when the truth would have sounded like manipulation. Because she stepped closer, closing the distance between them. Because I'm falling in love with you too, and I don't want to let fear stop me from admitting it. Even though the last person you loved died, Ethan asked gently. Even though, Madeline confirmed, maybe especially because Marcus taught me that love was worth the risk. I forgot that lesson for a long time. But you and Sophie, you've been teaching me to remember. Ethan reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands, both of them, the damaged one and the whole one, equally tender. I can't promise I won't hurt you, he said, or that loving me won't be complicated. I have a daughter who needs to come first. I have a past that still haunts me sometimes. I have limitations that I don't want promises, Madeline interrupted. I want honesty. I want someone who sees me as I actually am and chooses me anyway. I want... She didn't finish the sentence because Ethan kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper, pouring 16 years of grief and hope and hard-won resilience into the connection. Madeline kissed him back, tasting tears, hers or his, she couldn't tell, and feeling something unlock in her chest that had been closed since she was 19 years old. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. That was overdue, Madeline finished, by about a year. I was going to say perfect, Ethan replied, but overdue works too. They stood in the small kitchen, holding each other, and Madeline felt the pieces of her life, broken and scattered for so long, beginning to form something new, not the same as what she'd lost, but maybe something better because it was built on truth rather than performance, on vulnerability rather than armor. The months that followed were not without challenges. Richard launched a smear campaign suggesting Madeline's breakdown had been triggered by an inappropriate relationship with an employee. Forcing her to retain lawyers and issue public statements she found humiliating. Jonathan tried to poach several of the foundation's major donors, nearly bankrupting the program before Harold Blackwood intervened with a substantial gift and a public endorsement that shamed Jonathan into backing off. Sterling Industries, under Richard's renewed leadership, faced increasing scrutiny from journalists who'd picked up the thread Madeline had pulled. Patricia Chen's safety reports, once dismissed, became the subject of a federal investigation. Other victims of Sterling's negligence began coming forward, emboldened by Madeline's example. The company's stock price continued to fall, its reputation tarnished beyond easy repair. Madeline followed the news with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd wanted Sterling Industries to be held accountable, but she'd also hoped her father might choose transformation over defense. Instead, Richard doubled down, fighting every allegation, dismissing every criticism, clinging to power even as it cost him everything else. "He'll never change," Aunt Diana said over coffee one Saturday morning. She'd become a regular presence in Madeline's life, filling some of the void left by her mother's death. "Your father truly believes that admitting error is weakness. He'd rather be destroyed than admit he was wrong." "I used to think that way too," Madeline admitted. "That vulnerability was the same as defeat. It's exhausting living like that." "But you're not living like that anymore," Diana observed, glancing at where Ethan and Sophie were browsing the bakery counter, debating between croissants and muffins. "You've built something real, Maddie. Your mother would be so proud." "I wish she could have seen it," Madeline said. "Wish she could have known I finally understood what she tried to tell me, that the only empire worth building is one made of love and integrity rather than power and profit." "She knows," Diana said simply. "Wherever she is, however you conceive of what comes after, she knows." Sophie returned to the table with chocolate chip muffins for everyone, her face serious with the responsibility of having made an important decision. "Daddy says we're going to the park after this. Will you come with us, Madeline?" "I'd love to," Madeline replied, accepting the muffin Sophie handed her. "Good," Sophie said, satisfied, "because I want to practice the new song on the playground piano, and I need you both to listen." They spent the afternoon in Prospect Park, where the city had installed several public pianos as part of an arts initiative. Sophie played for anyone who'd listen, her technique improving but still charmingly imperfect, her joy in making music completely undiminished by her limitations. Other children gathered to watch, and some tried playing themselves, creating a spontaneous concert that attracted joggers and dog walkers and people who'd simply been passing by. Madeline sat on a bench with Ethan, their shoulders touching, watching Sophie bloom in the spring sunshine. "This is what I was trying to build," she said quietly. "When I challenged Sterling Industries, not specific programs or policies, but a world where children like Sophie have access to beauty, where talent isn't wasted because someone couldn't afford lessons, where people matter more than profit margins." "You're building it," Ethan said. "Maybe not at Sterling Industries, but here, at the foundation, and every kid who learns that music can be theirs regardless of their zip code." "It feels small sometimes," Madeline admitted, "compared to what I used to control." "Impact isn't measured in scale," Ethan replied. "It's measured in depth. You're changing individual lives in profound ways. That matters more than any corporate empire." A year after her removal from Sterling Industries, Madeline was invited to speak at a business ethics conference. She almost declined. Public speaking reminded her too much of shareholders' meetings and press conferences, of performance over authenticity. But the organizers were persistent, and finally Claire convinced her it was an opportunity to share what she'd learned. The conference was held in Boston, at a hotel conference center that reminded Madeline viscerally of her former life. She stood backstage listening to her introduction, feeling the old anxiety spike in her chest. But then her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Sophie wants you to know that you're the bravest person she knows. And I agree. You've got this." She walked onto the stage wearing the blue dress her mother had loved, her hair down, no armor except honesty. The audience was full of MBA students and young executives, people at the beginning of careers that might follow the path she'd taken or might fork in different directions. "A year ago," she began, "I was the CEO of a major corporation. I had power, money, influence, everything our culture tells us defines success. And I was miserable, because I'd achieved all of that by compromising principles I didn't even know I had, by valuing profit over people, by becoming someone I couldn't recognize in the mirror. She told them the story, all of it. The Christmas party and the song that shouldn't exist. Marcus and Ethan and the connections that bridge death and time. Patricia's safety reports and her father's retaliation. The choice she'd made to tell the truth, even when it cost her everything. The life she'd built from the ruins. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that doing the right thing is easy," she said. "It's not. It cost me my position, my relationship with my father, my fiancé, my entire professional identity. There were days I questioned whether any principle was worth that much sacrifice." She paused, finding her truth. "But here's what I gained: the ability to sleep at night. Relationships built on authenticity rather than utility. Work that connects directly to human flourishing instead of just shareholder returns. The love of a man whose courage humbles me, and a child who reminds me daily what actually matters." She scanned the audience, seeing young faces hungry for permission to be both successful and ethical. "You're going to face choices in your careers where the right thing conflicts with the profitable thing, and you'll have to decide who you want to be. I'm here to tell you that choosing integrity over advancement is possible, that building a life according to your values instead of others' expectations is possible, that you can fail spectacularly at one thing and succeed beautifully at something else." The applause when she finished felt different than any she'd received as CEO. Warmer, more genuine, less about power and more about connection. During the Q&A session, a young woman in the back raised her hand. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Giving up that much power for principle?" Madeline thought about the question seriously, honoring its weight. "Sometimes I regret how I did it," she said. "I could have been more strategic, more careful, more politically astute. But regret what I did? No. Because that choice led me to a life I actually want to live, with people I actually want to be around, doing work that actually matters to me. And I'd make the same choice again." After the conference, she returned to New York to find Ethan and Sophie waiting at the train station with flowers and a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome home, our hero." Sophie ran to her the moment she appeared, nearly knocking her over with the force of her hug. "You were on TV," Sophie announced. "Daddy recorded your speech and we watched it together, and you were so smart and beautiful, and I told everyone at school that you're my almost mom." Madeline froze. "You're what?" Sophie looked uncertain suddenly, as if she'd revealed a secret. "My almost mom. Because you and Daddy love each other, and you're at our apartment all the time, and you help me with homework, and you're teaching me about business, and—" She turned to Ethan. "I wasn't supposed to say that yet, was I?" Ethan looked simultaneously mortified and hopeful. "That's a conversation for grown-ups, princess." But Madeline was smiling through tears she didn't try to hide. "Almost, Mom," she repeated, tasting the words. "I like that." "You do?" Sophie asked, bouncing on her toes. "I do," Madeline confirmed. "Though maybe we should have an actual conversation about it. The grown-ups, I mean." That conversation happened that night, after Sophie was asleep, after Ethan had made tea and they'd settled on the couch that had become as familiar to Madeline as any furniture in her own apartment. "I know it's fast," Ethan said. "We've only been together officially for 6 months, and I know you never planned on being a mother, that Sophie comes with complications and responsibilities you didn't sign up for." "Stop," Madeline interrupted. "I love Sophie. She's extraordinary and brave, and she looks at the world with wonder I'd forgotten was possible, being part of her life. That's not a complication. It's a gift." "What about marriage?" Ethan asked carefully. "Is that something you'd want, eventually?" "Is this a proposal?" Madeline asked, her heart racing. "Not yet," Ethan replied. "Because when I propose, I want it to be perfect, or at least perfectly imperfect in a way that reflects who we actually are. But I'm asking if it's something you'd be open to. If building a life together, you, me, and Sophie, is something you'd want." Madeline thought about her previous engagement to Jonathan, that carefully orchestrated arrangement that had checked every box except the most important one: love. She thought about her mother, who'd married for position and spent decades regretting it. She thought about Marcus, whose death had convinced her that loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. But looking at Ethan, thinking about Sophie asleep in the next room, remembering the past year of building something real from broken pieces. She understood that love wasn't about destruction. It was about reconstruction, about taking all the damaged parts of yourself and trusting someone else to help reshape them into something whole. Yes, she said simply. I want that. All of it. 2 months later, in a moment that was both perfectly planned and completely spontaneous, Ethan proposed. Not with an expensive ring in a fancy restaurant, but with a simple band he'd designed himself, presented in Prospect Park while Sophie played piano for the gathering crowd and spring flowers bloomed in defiant color. I can't promise you easy, Ethan said, kneeling on the ground that hundreds of people walked across daily, making something sacred out of something ordinary. I can't promise perfect, but I can promise real. I can promise that I'll see you, choose you, love you exactly as you are for as long as we both shall live. Yes, Madeline said, not needing to think about it, not needing to calculate risks or measure costs. Yes, Sophie shrieked with joy, and the crowd applauded, and someone took a photo that would end up in the Times wedding section 6 months later, accompanied by a story about the former CEO who'd chosen love and integrity over power and profit. The wedding itself was small, held at the foundation with Harold Blackwood walking Madeline down the aisle because her father had refused to come. Richard had sent a formal note declining the invitation, his final statement that Madeline's choices had cost her his approval. It hurt, but not as much as she'd expected. Some relationships couldn't be saved, no matter how much you wanted them to be. But Aunt Diana was there, weeping openly. Claire was there as maid of honor, looking elegant and slightly uncomfortable in a dress. Sophie was flower girl, taking her responsibility so seriously she counted each petal she dropped. And students from the foundation, children who'd learned that music could be theirs regardless of their circumstances, formed an impromptu orchestra, playing pieces they'd learned, creating a soundtrack for a ceremony that celebrated transformation. Ethan played too, performing Completion in its final form, the song that had started with Marcus's love, been transformed by Ethan's pain, and now ended with hope for a future built by 3 people who'd learned that broken things could be beautiful. When it came time for vows, Madeline spoke without notes, without performance, just truth. I spent 16 years believing that love was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness, that the only way to survive was to armor myself against feeling anything at all. You taught me I was wrong. You and Sophie taught me that the greatest courage is the willingness to be seen, to be known, to risk being hurt because connection matters more than safety. I love you both, and I promise to spend the rest of my life choosing that love over any fear. Ethan's vows were simpler but no less profound. You saw me when I was invisible. You valued me when I felt worthless. You chose courage when it would have been easier to choose comfort. I promise to see you, value you, and choose you every day in every way that matters. They sealed their promises with a kiss, while Sophie cheered and the foundation students played, and somewhere in the city that had witnessed both Madeline's rise and fall, life continued its relentless rhythm. Some people choosing power, some choosing love, all of them writing their own stories with whatever courage they could muster. The reception was held in the same space, with food from the neighborhood restaurants that supported the foundation and music played by students who were still learning but created beauty anyway. Madeline danced with Ethan, with Sophie, with Harold and Claire and Aunt Diana. She danced until her feet hurt and her face ached from smiling, until the evening dissolved into the kind of joy that only comes from showing up fully as yourself. Near midnight, she stepped outside for air, standing in the Brooklyn street where she could hear the distant hum of the city that had been her home for 3 decades. She'd been born into Manhattan privilege, raised in towers that insulated her from ordinary life, taught that success meant dominating rather than connecting. And now she stood in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, married to a man who cleaned office buildings, stepmother to a child who believed in superheroes, running a nonprofit that would never make her rich, but made her feel wealthy in ways money couldn't measure. Regrets? Ethan asked, joining her on the sidewalk. Not even one, Madeline replied. Not even your father? I know that hurt, his absence today. It hurt, Madeline admitted. But I can't make him choose love over pride. I can only make that choice for myself. And I choose this. You, Sophie, the life we're building. I choose all of it. Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. Are you coming back to the party? Aunt Diana says there's still cake. There's always cake, Ethan said, scooping his daughter into his arms. That's the secret of life. There's always cake if you know where to look. They returned to the celebration, three people who'd found each other through music and loss, and the stubborn belief that some things were worth fighting for, even when fighting meant losing everything you thought defined you. The party continued until the early hours, finally winding down as guests departed with full hearts and the satisfied exhaustion of having witnessed something true. Years later, when people asked Madeline about her decision to walk away from Sterling Industries, she'd tell them it wasn't walking away. It was walking toward authenticity, toward connection, toward a life that reflected who she actually was instead of who she'd been told to be. The foundation thrived, expanding to serve 5 boroughs and impacting thousands of children who might otherwise never have accessed music education. Ethan's teaching inspired several students to pursue professional careers, creating a ripple effect of artistic achievement that extended far beyond anything he'd accomplished as a performer. And Sophie grew up understanding that courage meant showing up as yourself, that integrity mattered more than approval, that love required vulnerability, but offered rewards no amount of armor could provide. Sterling Industries eventually faced consequences it couldn't buy or bury. Federal investigations led to substantial fines and mandated reforms. Richard was forced to step down, his reputation tarnished beyond recovery. The company survived but diminished, a cautionary tale about the cost of prioritizing profit over principle. Madeline watched from a distance, feeling sadness for what her father had lost, but not regret for the role she'd played in revealing truth. Some systems needed to be torn down so something better could be built. Some stories needed to end so new ones could begin. On the anniversary of Marcus's death, 18 years after the accident that had stolen him from the world, Madeline, Ethan, and Sophie returned to Prospect Park with the public piano. Ethan played Completion, while Sophie sang lyrics she'd written herself. Words about love that transcends death, about music that connects past and present, about beauty created by broken people refusing to stay broken. A crowd gathered as they always did, drawn by music that spoke to something fundamental about the human experience. When the last notes faded, a young man approached, probably in his early 20s, with Marcus's features and his mother's eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncertain. "That song, my brother wrote that, or started it. Marcus Chen. He died when I was 3, so I barely remember him, but my mother played recordings of his music all the time. How do you know it?" Ethan and Madeline exchanged glances, then Ethan spoke gently. "Marcus was my best friend. I'm Ethan Coltrane. And this is Madeline. She was the love he wrote that song for. We've been finishing it together, honoring his memory by making sure his music didn't die with him." The young man's eyes filled with tears. "I'm David Chen. He was my brother. My mother never got over losing him. She died 2 years ago, and I've been trying to find pieces of him ever since. Recordings, stories, anything that helps me know who he was." "Would you like to know him?" Madeline asked gently. "Really know him? Because we have stories, we have memories. We have 17 years of learning to understand the gift he gave us before he left." They talked for hours, sitting on park benches while Sophie played nearby, sharing memories of a boy who'd died too young but whose influence rippled forward through time, connecting strangers, inspiring music, teaching people that love mattered more than power ever could. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that seemed designed for this exact moment, David Chen hugged them both. "Thank you," he said simply, "for keeping him alive, for making sure his music mattered, for showing me that he wasn't just a name on a headstone, but a person who touched lives." After he left, Madeline leaned against Ethan's shoulder, watching Sophie chase pigeons with the unself-conscious joy of children who hadn't yet learned to armor themselves against wonder. "Do you think this is what Marcus would have wanted?" she asked. "All of it. The song finished, us finding each other, his brother learning his story?" "I think," Ethan replied carefully, "Marcus would have wanted us to be happy, to live fully, to create beauty especially when life breaks us. And I think we're doing that. Maybe not the way he imagined, but in a way that honors what he believed. What did he believe? Madeline asked, though she thought she knew. That love was worth the risk, Ethan said. That music could heal what words couldn't touch. That the only failure was refusing to try because you were afraid of failing. That we're all broken, but broken things can still create beauty if we're brave enough to keep creating. Sophie ran back to them, breathless and flushed. Can we come back tomorrow? She asked. I want to play the piano here again. I want everyone to hear. We can come back whenever you want, Princess, Ethan promised. The music isn't going anywhere, and neither are we. They walked home through Brooklyn streets as evening fell, three people who'd found each other through tragedy and transformed it into grace. Behind them, the park slowly emptied as people returned to their lives, their own stories, their own choices about what mattered and what they'd fight for. And in a penthouse in Manhattan that Madeline had long since sold, new occupants looked out at the glittering city and made their own calculations about success and power and the cost of achieving both. They didn't know yet that some victories were hollow, that some defeats were actually liberations, that the only empire worth building was the one constructed from love and integrity rather than dominance and fear. But maybe they'd learn. Maybe someone would tell them Madeline's story, the CEO who'd walked away from everything to reclaim herself. Maybe that story would inspire them to choose differently, to value people over profit, to remember that we're all broken, but brokenness isn't the same as worthlessness. Or maybe they wouldn't learn. Maybe they'd repeat all the same mistakes, chase all the same illusions, discover too late that power without principle was just another kind of poverty. Either way, Madeline had made her choice. She'd torn down the empire her father had built and constructed something better from the ruins. A life built on truth, a family chosen through courage, a legacy measured not in quarterly earnings, but in children who learned that beauty belonged to them, that music could be theirs, that being broken didn't mean being finished. She'd chosen love over power, vulnerability over armor, connection over control, and she'd never been happier. The song Marcus had started, Ethan had finished, and they'd all made their own. That song continued playing in practice rooms and public parks, in Sophie's performances and her students' recitals, in every moment when someone chose to create beauty despite their limitations, to love despite the risk, to show up authentic despite the cost. Because that was the gift of completion, not perfection, but the courage to finish what fear said was impossible, to build something whole from broken pieces, to believe that some melodies were meant to be finished, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, no matter how many times you had to start over. And in the ending was the beginning of Sophie's story, of the students' stories, of every person who heard the music and understood that they too could choose courage, that they too could rebuild, that they too could create something beautiful from their brokenness if they were brave enough to try. The melody played on, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation, a song about love that death couldn't silence, about truth that fear couldn't suppress, about the stubborn human capacity to create beauty even when, especially when, life tries to convince us we're too broken to matter. Marcus had started it, Ethan had finished it, Madeline had lived it, and now it belonged to everyone willing to listen, to learn, to love, despite the cost. The song of completion, the song of courage, the song of choosing what matters.